for all your business support to CHS.
Thanks, Kevin. So I just want to touch on something that has come up from you, and it'll get mentioned today a little bit later. And that's the word trust. That's been thrown back at us, and I'm just wondering if it's time to find a different word, or to find a different. I mean, to be challenging and ask questions. That's why you're obviously here today. But if we can go back. And we can all identify times where CHS has probably stubbed our toe, tripped, or worse. You can find the right definition that you want. But I'll also say that was a time where we had people that had large egos, people that maybe got over their head on some things. And we had some people that made some honest mistakes. I'm saying we have moved on. I'm calling that a different administration and a different board. We have really stepped up how to identify some things, so nothing falls through the cracks. I chair the risk committee. We have really stepped up our internal audit. And that was something our auditors mentioned to us, that we need to do that. We've got a really good relationship with our auditors. He's really frank with us. You know, you need to do something here, you need to identify something here, you need to step up here. And we've done that. There's training constantly going on for management as well as the board to make sure we keep doing the right thing. And I think we've, it's probably been the last, well, I'll be honest, it's been since Jay came on board where I think we've really stepped up and have identified those things. So I hope we've earned your trust back. The things that happened 10, 15 years ago, is it fair to hold that over our head? I know you'll remind us from time to time, but maybe it's time to move on. So I hope we've earned your trust. And like I said, that word will get used, but I hope we've earned it. I feel we have. And so I just wanted to throw that out there that maybe it's time to move on. As you'll notice, I've got 2 years left. I may be getting a little more gutsy on things I'll say in front of people. So I'll also remind you that in 2 years, I will be done. So I know there's people in this room that are interested and continue to ask questions, figure out if that's something you want to do, can do, and are willing to do. So with that, I think I'll just turn it over to Dan. To have some opening remarks we'll get into why we're here today. So
Sure. You guys are taking turns. Okay. I guess I'm standing over here. I'm Dan, chairman of the board of CHS. With me here today is Dave Childers and Tracy Jones. They both serve on the capital committee, so they're here to talk because they're the experts in some of the issues that we're going to talk about today on capital. So are we okay on audio? And are they saying they can hear us? Okay. Hi, Jackie. Okay. And are they seeing visual too, or just?
They're seeing the slide.
You're seeing the slides.
Are you advancing the slides, Danny?
Yeah.
Do you have a clicker?
Why don't we get that set up? Just let me introduce a few things. First of all, thank you for coming and joining us, and I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to have this discussion. We are in a long process. We talked about this at the annual meeting. The annual meeting was the first rollout of our thoughts on this capital structure. And it's a 2-year process for us. So we started introducing the process to you, talking about it last summer. We talked about that we were in that process. We're discussing these things, but we hadn't come to any strong conclusions yet. The board took a lot of time and a great deal of time to look at alternatives. We used a lot of outside resources, looked at a lot of scenarios, trying to look into the future. Obviously, we're looking into the future is difficult. We don't know what the future holds, but we came up with some thoughts on what we think is important for this company to be successful long term. So this process will continue on for the rest of this year. We're looking to bring you a bylaw amendment then in 2023's annual meeting. We have two bylaw amendments. We haven't talked about the other one, which is to change region directors, taking one from Minnesota, moving it to the Iowa and South region, which is Region 7. That we will ask you to vote on also during the annual meeting. That will take place in 2024. So that process doesn't take place till the next year. There is this forward-looking statement, and you obviously don't want to read that, but it's what it says, and we say this every meeting, is that we're going to talk about the future. We may get that wrong. That's what that says. We will likely do that. This one is an added one, and I want to spend a little time here talking about this because after the annual meeting, we had a lot of questions that came from you and others. And we're going to show you some charts that look backwards at some of the history you have, trying to project, well, what would have happened had we had certain bylaw provisions in place? Those are projections that have a lot of variables, and we had to make assumptions on some of those variables just to try to give you something that you could look at. Again, a lot of projections about what would that previous board have done? What would the interest rates be? What would you think of that? How would we react to that? A lot of variables that we had to come up with some solutions to. This is saying that these are just a lot of variables, a lot of guesses. Just keep that in mind as we look through these charts. When we look at bylaw amendments, when we look at patronage and how we're going to distribute patronage, how we're going to redeem it, we have these three pillars. We've talked about this, I think, at every meeting now for the last 4 or 5 years. First of all, we're going to make sure we have a strong balance sheet. We're going to maintain a strong balance sheet. That's just a given. We're going to do that. Secondly, we want to make sure that this company is in position to grow. And when we see those opportunities that we think are a good opportunity for you as owners, and we should be investing in them, we want to be able to do that. So we want to position the company to be strong so we can grow. And then lastly, we want to keep in mind that CHS and what's best for the company. That's our owners. What is best for you? And that's the things like making sure we have the right assets in the right places. It also means patronage and redemptions and making sure we have a valuable patronage program, a valuable redemption program. So Dave, I think you're going to cover this. What's the challenges?
Yeah, what is a challenge? To better understand what was working well at CHS with the equity and what are the adjustments we felt needed to be had, we engaged a capital, tax, and legal experts to look more deeply into our equity management program to make sure that we have done the best we can, make sure it's a sustainable program going into the future. Through their work alongside with the board, we've identified some of these challenges. The first challenge that's been identified is the fact that CHS is issuing equity far faster than they're capable of redeeming. The second challenge, the CHS board has too few tools to try help give us the flexibility we need to have a sustainable equity management program going into the future.
Thanks, Dave. The third item that was identified by the board was the treatment of our preferred stock dividends has resulted in the issuance of increased equity. So let me just kind of reframe what's going on with preferred stock. So you may be aware CHS has about $2.3 billion in preferred stock. We have to pay the owners of that preferred stock, we pay them dividends. Those dividends are what we call interest-like. So because we're paying them for the use of their money. Those dividends, the way our bylaws are currently written, are not deductible from our patronage sourced income. So what we're wanting to do is to change it. Dave will get into this more in the next slide. But we want to bring those into the equation to make those deductible. That one item, number 3, since the start of our preferred stock has resulted in about $1 billion of equity that's been issued.
So if you look at our balance sheet, we're talking here, this is showing our allocated and unallocated equity. So this is your member equity that you have in the company. We have $7.4 billion of member equity. And that's split up at 5.4 billion is the allocated equity, which we're describing as that has a name on it. It's in your name and it's sitting on your balance sheet in the allocated equity section with your name on it, somebody's name on it. Unallocated equity is that can come from non-member business or a part of the patronage that we stream through. We don't put a name on it, still your equity, but it doesn't have a name. So there's been some confusion, and we heard this at the annual meeting about this, that one of the comments that comes up is, well, what about a dissolution? In a dissolution, all of this is your equity, whether there's a name on it or not. It creates some challenges, of course, because if it doesn't have a name on it, how does the board decide how to divvy that up? But the reality is it's all your allocated equity. It just maybe doesn't have your name on it. David, this one.
Okay, yeah, and this chart, I want to explain. First of all, I want you to take a close look at the vertical axis. It shows incrementally the amount of equity that has grown since 1999 from 1 billion to 6 billion. And then the horizontal axis, you'll see it starts reflecting the equity as it's been accumulated since 1999 to the year 2022. And in the last 15 years, the volume of allocated equity has nearly tripled. If you look at that chart, how it starts to escalate dramatically the last 15 years. And as you can see, that equity grew, and those are years that we had very profitable years, and we returned a lot of cash to the country, yet we still accumulated far more equity than we're capable of redeeming. And this is just plain unsustainable. If we continue managing our equity in this manner, it will likely mean that the CHS equity program will be less valuable to you, our owners, over time. It'll just take us many more years to redeem that equity.
And leave that slide, go back that one for just a second. We're going to come back to this slide again, but I want to make a note. I told Trent about this slide. We're currently sitting about right here, 08, 09. So if you look at that 08, 09, this is what's been redeemed. This is what's ahead. So I just want to make that note. We'll come back to that slide.
And we got a better slide that's going to
Yeah.
really, it'll show definitively where that line is.
We'll come back to that one. So I want to take my time on this one also. This slide goes back to the year 2000, all the way up through 2023, which is this year, basically the equity that's going to be issued here shortly. So you can see the dollar amounts on the left. These are basically hundreds of thousands, and the green bars are allocated equity issued. So that's what we issue. The blue bars are the amount of allocated equity redeemed in each year. So as you can see, the years are relatively close, and then as we get down to here this year, the blue bar shows what's been issued. I'm sorry, the green bar shows what's been issued, the blue bar is what's been redeemed. On that last year, really a great year, something that everybody's proud of. We returned $1 billion in cash. We're still going to issue more equity than we're able to redeem on a year like this.
In fact, we redeemed 500 million. We're issuing 630, 40 million approximately. Yeah, another 100+ million.
And just while we're on this chart, this is a good one to illustrate. We had the question at the annual meeting about when did preferred stock start. And so it started in 2003. And if you look back at the chart, we started using the first preferred stock we used was to redeem equity. The company was thinking that they didn't want to use cash to redeem equity, that they would use the preferred stock instead to redeem equity. That started in 2003 and went up, and I think till 10 or 11, 12, somewhere in that range, where we were using preferred stock to redeem our equity, so we didn't burn through cash. So and then in these time periods were the really tall ones. If you look at our cash flows, we were negative cash flow. We had a lot of expenses. We had a lot of investment. We were investing at very high rates in those time frames. Plus, we were paying out a lot in cash to our owners. caused us to have to borrow some money to incur those cash demands. I don't think you can say, there's sort of a question, whether I had a question at the end, maybe if we borrow money to pay patronage, I don't think you can say that. Because you borrow money to fund the whole company, whether that's used for different parts of your capital structure. It wasn't just to pay patronage.
I think the take home for me on this slide is every single year in the last 23, CHS has issued more than we're able to redeem. Every single year.
Sorry, we done there? Okay, so this chart, we had a question about, well, what, at the annual meeting during one of the question and answered was asking about how we compare to others. We had done some research over the past couple of years about our structure versus others, and what we found was that we're kind of an anomaly. Having a restriction in our bylaws is not typical. Most cooperatives do not have restrictions in their bylaws for their board members that they can, that they have to only put a certain amount or put none at all into their unallocated reserve. As we looked around and discussed this, and we've learned this again after the meetings, that most boards have 100% flexibility to do what they want and do what they think is in the best interest of their owners. So we're a little bit of an anomaly that we have that restriction. That restriction came out of merger talks that happened when they put Cenex and Harvest States together. But if you look at this chart is showing the percent of allocated versus unallocated equity that is typical for cooperatives, and we don't have the names, but these are the larger cooperative members of ours, plus some of our peer regionals. We didn't put the names because we didn't ask their permission to share this data. We're at 28%. As you can see, the average median is 65%. So most cooperatives would have more unallocated equity on their balance sheet by a lot than we do. You may ask them, well, why do you need unallocated equity? What do you use it for? One of the things we use it for is our preferred stock dividend. Every year, $169 million goes out of our unallocated reserve to pay our preferred stock dividend. Plus, it's those funds that you also use to grow the company and make growth for you, look at capital purchases for you, our owners. If you think about us, we have roughly 30%, and it's been consistent since I've been on the board. I think Steve, you too, that 30% of our income is non-member business. It's been very consistent for as long as I can remember, and that hasn't changed. We believe that is a comfortable number for us as a board. We believe it's a number that at this time we don't want to grow. But we think the focus should be on our owners and the business with our owners.
So what are the potential solutions? The board has identified 2 potential updates to the CHS bylaws. And for the equity management to give us more sustainable management program going into the future. And we're sharing those with you today. And as we walk our way through this, and as we get closer to the fiscal year end and the next year's annual meeting, we'll have more definitive decisions to be made as to what and how we're going to move this forward. Do we maintain what we're looking at now? Do we change it? We're still giving that consideration. But at this point in time, we're looking at the first part of the potential bylaw changes would be able to give the board more flexibility in the amount of equity held back. We propose allowing the board to hold back up to 45% instead of the current 10% of holdback each year. The board would need to decide the holdback amount each year within that range of 0 to 45%. The second part would be to the potential bylaws would be to allow the board to take the earnings, to reduce the earnings, the preferred stock dividends in the calculation of patronage, similar to the treatment of interest. And I think I should clarify that a little bit because some people get confused. That's just allowing the board to deduct that cost of that. Because currently, as Dan just said, the 169 million of dividends that gets paid out each year does not go through the P&L. And if this proposed bylaw passes, it still will not go through the P&L. It just will allow the board to deduct that cost in the calculation of patronage. These changes will not impact the amount of cash CHS generates each year, nor would it speed up or slow down the rate at which we redeem the current equity you hold. The current equity you hold will not be impacted by this decision. This decision would only impact future equity issued. And that would give us a far more sustainable equity management program going into the future.
Dave, just for some clarity here, so the 169 that we talked about, that's the amount of dividends we pay to the preferred stockholders every year. The amount that would be deducted from patronage earnings is not 169 million, because every year we would do a calculation, just like we do with interest, that, okay, for instance, 30% of our income comes from a non-member business. So we would deduct 30% from that calculation on interest. We would do the same thing for preferred stock. So likely the deduction would be somewhere around 115 to 120 million dollars, not the 160.
Right. I neglected to say that. Thanks for the catch.
That makes sense. We can come back to that. Yeah, of course. That's more effective. So just this check, does any of these changes affect the cash? We talked about this a lot, but Tracy, maybe you can hit this again.
Sure, Dan. You go to the next slide. This is, I really can't stress this enough. This is a non-cash change is what we're talking about. We're talking about moving equity from the allocated side to the unallocated side. So here's a clip of our balance sheet. You can see equity certificates. You can see where the change, there would be less equity certificates, and the exact same amount would be added to the line here. It says capital reserves. It's still in the equities. So there's, we've heard people say, well, what are you going to do with the extra cash? There is no extra cash. There's no extra cash in this. This is a non-cash transaction. Stuff.
Oh, there we go. Now we're stuck.
Now we did it. I think I even know what slide it is.
So while we're waiting, maybe I'll touch on this cash thing. So Tracy said it doesn't affect the way we think about cash. So there are some things it does affect though. So when you think about the way we're going to pass out patronage, would we have made the same decision had we had these bylaws this year? How would we distribute our cash? Would we still distribute 500 million in cash patronage and 500 in redemptions? Likely so. The cash that's generated from the company doesn't get affected by this. But to be clear, in future years, the earnings that you have on your name, it will be different. So in future years, there will be less that has your name on it. If we put more of it for instance, using preferred stock deductions, you won't have as much allocated equity in future years.
I'll get it.
You'll be reinvesting back in the company. And then the board, this gives the board the flexibility to make those decisions, whether we need to do that or not. And whether we can continue to pay and allocate at a strong level, if we have to hold back to do some large purchase, to grow your company, to do something like that, that gives that board that flexibility. And I think the same flexibility you likely have as you serve on your board. So let's just keep moving on. So, we had some discussion about, there was some questions about, well, what if it was 25%? What if it was 35%? So let's just talk about why did we pick 45%? Why was that number? So let's walk through that.
Okay, well, we're jumping a little ahead here, Mr. Chairman, but
That's okay. That was the slide I remember.
we had a sequence worked out where we're going to follow the slide deck, who's doing what. So he just threw us a curveball. So that's the chairman's prerogative. So yeah, the capital structure experts that we were consulted at CHS suggested that we ask for as much flexibility as necessary to get this problem corrected. However, the tax and the accounting people strongly suggested that we keep any request for additional flexibility under 50% of holdback. And so we had, as a board, we landed at 45%, thinking that would give us the best flexibility and make sure that we still keep within the parameters of tax rules, so we don't get recognized as holding back too much given the size of our cooperative.
Let's just take some time and talk about this, because I think this is an important point. We get the pushback about 45%. The number, I hope you just take with you, that the number is not so important. It's giving the board the flexibility to make good choices. Not me, not Dave, it's the future board that's going to have to make these choices. Giving them that flexibility. We came up with 45% because that was a recommendation by our attorneys. We think that makes some sense. A lot of cooperatives would not operate in that realm. They would operate in a higher level than that. But given that we have a spotlight on us being a large cooperative, we don't want to jeopardize that ability for us to operate as a cooperative under tax structure for CHS, but it also jeopardizes maybe your ability, because if we get looked at, likely everybody else gets looked at. So we think it's important for us to stay under 45, but we also think we should give that future board the flexibility to do the right thing. So that's how we came up with the 45 number. I just hope you don't get too hung up on it. We are going to talk about some other numbers and what we're looking back and how that affects it, but I hope you would consider we're talking about a change that gives the board flexibility, not a change to go to 45%. None of us want to stay at 45%. We're directors, we want to try to make our owners happy. And we intend to do that. Hey, acting is one of the ways to do it. So where are we at now?
Why can't we earn our way?
Why can't we earn our way out? So we hear that. You can just earn your way out of this. Just make more money. That's the solution. It's been working. Just earn your way out.
Yeah, that's, as Dan said, that's, we've heard that a lot. And so this is a little bit of a repeat chart. And here again, I'm going to start here at 2000, and we go for 23 years. The green bars are the allocated equity issued, and the blue bars are the allocated equity redeemed. So as you can imagine, in that 23 years, we've had some really good earnings years. As FY23, really good earnings years. But the one consistent thing is we consistently issue more than we're able to redeem. So as much as I'd love to stay here and say, well, yeah, we can just earn our way out of it, that's not what history has shown us with the chart.
You also go back to when we started preferred stock, the first series of preferred stock, we started at that in 2003. All of that, up almost $300 million, was used to redeem old equity. That was not cash coming out of the company. That was cash we generated by selling preferred stock.
So let's take a look at the preferred stock and how that would have been impacted. And we had the ability to deduct the cost of that since the beginning here in 2000. Again, looking at this chart, I want you to take a close look, because sometimes when the green and the blue are so close together, it's hard to differentiate. So on the left-hand side, again, we have the 100 million increments of hundreds of millions of dollars in the years 2000 through 2023. The blue bars are represent the equity that's been issued. The green bars represent the hypothetical, and we've been able to deduct the preferred stock dividends. And the gold bars represent the allocated equity that was redeemed each year from 2000 through 2023. And as you can see through this time period, there's really no significant difference between what was actually issued and what was could have been hypothetically issued each one of those years. However, as was already mentioned, that would have accumulated. If you think about it now, we've got $5.4 billion of allocated equity that needs to be redeemed. If we had this at our disposal, plus the 10% holdback, that would have got us up to $4.5 billion. So there's $900 million difference if we had this available to the board through all these years. And why? The reason we say hypothetical, we can't say for sure what each one of those boards would have done each one of those years as well. So it's still hypothetical, but this is the way it could have looked and we had that available to us.
If I could, for a moment, I also want to focus on this chart because I've got, we've got a couple of very similar charts coming. So I want you to get used to looking at what we're looking at. So the blue is the actual of what was issued. And the green, the next one is what hypothetically would have been issued. And the one thing that does not change in this chart or the ones here that we're going to show you in a minute is the actual that is redeemed. So as you can see, even with just the preferred stock being deducted, we're issuing a dramatic amount more than we're redeeming each year. So just kind of get this focused, and we're gonna talk about some other charts as we go ahead here.
And the 900 million is significant. Don't get us wrong, but it's not enough to correct the equity management situation we're in. We need more than this.
So Dave, make sure you use the microphone so we can hear you online. So what Dave just said is the 900 or the preferred stock does have an impact. If you look back, it did have an impact, but maybe not the impact we needed to correct the problem that we have.
But Dan, it still would have been $1 billion to the favor of the equity that has to be paid out today, correct? That $1 billion is preferred stock in that 5.4 billion. So at what point, you guys just figured that out, what, a year or two ago, that you can do this? And that's why the bylaw change is coming, which I think we'd all agree to that. But who figured that out, and had that have been way back when you did the preferred stock, that would have been $1 billion less you would owe.
So it wouldn't have been $1 billion because of roughly 30% of that would be non-PAT. We would have to allocate to non-PAT.
Okay, 700 million.
700 million.
There's still 700 million less we got to pay off.
Right.
That's correct.
So now we have to pay for that sin.
Remember, you don't have to pay for it. You don't got the money.
It's issued.
You
It's
already
not
got-
redeemed, it's issued.
Well, if this 45 goes through, we have to pay for it.
But you were, so we had this at the annual meeting and this question also, and I think there's some confusion here. The money didn't disappear, it didn't evaporate, it was allocated back to the owners. So it wasn't lost, it wasn't given away, it wasn't spoiled, it was allocated back to the owners. Now we're trying to correct this issue so we don't continue to balloon this problem.
We received it. Yeah, that. Look at it how you guys want to look at it.
I'm not arguing.
Well, we better fix it now than later. I mean, it certainly needs to be corrected. I think we can agree on that, Tony. It needs to be corrected.
Show us that amount and we'll write it off on our books.
I'd like to write it
I'd
on.
like to see a chart. In the future, you're gonna have more meetings. So I'd like to see a chart that would show if a co-op A out in the country gets $100,000 back right now. And you're gonna do this, how does it affect cash and the equity they're getting back? On a normal year, just like a statement of operating we get from you guys every year based on our purchases. If we're gonna get X back, let's say this year we're getting 200,000 back. But you change all this stuff with your 45% and that you're doing, and 165, how much less will we get back?
Well, as far as the cash, like this year, Dan said, the cash for this year's, the cash available is the cash available. Going forward, if this were implemented, and first of all, remember, we are not locking in on 45%. We gotta be mindful of that. It's even at that point, the cash available each year will be the cash available. Just as it is now, with an outstanding year, we're returning $1 billion.
Right, and I realize, but with the 45%, your needs aren't gonna quit after this year. The needs will always be there for more cash. I mean, every co-op is the same way, but our needs for cash are, our new deals or whatever else you're getting into, that's always gonna be there. So that 45% is gonna be kind of hit almost every year, the way we see it. But I want to see how it really affects the local co-op.
So
Hang on a second, Dan, I'll let you, okay. I want to see how it affects the local co-op, because that tells us whether we really want to buy from CHS or not. If we're not getting anything back or half what we got back before, you start, it's like the years when you guys took the non-qualified. There's a lot of clubs that question whether they want to do business with CHS anymore. And you're getting to less and less loyal customers as old people like me retire. The next generation sees less loyalty to CHS and said, well, if we're gonna get back less, let's start shopping. And I don't want to see that because that, I've been in the system 35 years, great system, work with you guys well. But that's where we're really concerned, how it's going to affect us on the local level of what we're going to get back, whether it's equity or cash, period.
If I'm hearing you right, the tough thing for me to answer that is if you want to see how it impacts your co-op. That's kind of a one-on-one conversation. We certainly don't want to do a slide deck reflecting
You
each
could do co-op, using a
hypothetical.
hypothetical and say they get back 250,000 on this year, or 200, I mean, even numbers, 200,000 or whatever it is. Going forward, if it was the new way you guys are proposing, they would get back X, equity and cash.
Yeah, well,
That makes it easier to swallow one way or not.
the one thing we also have to remember is none of this really gets impacted until we redeem all the equity that's currently on the books. That's going to take some time. We're both going to be retired a long time before we get there. It's just going to take several years to get all that redeemed. And once we get to that point, for us to put a slide together to say, this is how it's going to look in that amount of time frame, think about your business. How is that going to look X amount of years from now? It's hard to predict. We can do something like that, but I'm not sure how much value it would have.
So I think that Dave, a couple of points. First of all, we don't intend to do 45 every year. I disagree with you on that. I don't think that's the intent at all. I hope that's not our intent. That's not what we want to do. If you look at the chart though, if you want to know the impact, it gets complicated because you have both producers and co-ops. So let's just talk co-ops first. Co-ops were to 2009. So we have this pool from 2009 this direction, fairly large pool of equity that we have to burn through. It's got to be 4 billion something for cooperatives that we have to pay out. So what you get, whether it's cash patronage or redemptions, doesn't change until we get through this pool. It's what we're allocating now that get paid in the future that changes. So the effect to you in the short run is none. There's no effect to you in the short run. It gets later as we try to manage this pool that in the future, 15, 20 years from now, you may get a little less because we didn't allocate as much to you today that you get paid in the future. The difficulty becomes the producer. So the individual producer that works for country ops, they get paid at the states at age 70, and then there's a provision that they get paid every 5 years if they ask for it. So they could get paid sooner. It could affect them sooner because they get paid out earlier than a cooperative does. That's the complication in trying to predict how this might look. But if you want to know how it affects you next year, it does not affect you next year. It affects you 20 years from now when you start redeeming this equity that you earned this year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we've got some charts that'll help illustrate a little bit. I want to echo. This is a non-cash, the cash is the cash. At CHS, you've heard the term, we pay cash as we can afford. We pay cash as available. A year like this past year, you should love that term because that was a lot of cash. $1 billion in cash was phenomenal, not just because of the earnings, but we were in a tremendous cash flow position and we could do that. And so as a board, we voted to let's send back $1 billion. So what am I asking to do? I'm asking that I issue you less equity that's going to be redeemed in the future. But if I don't redeem that equity for 30 or 40 or 50 years, am I really asking you to sacrifice anything? What's that dollar worth in 50 years? And we got some more charts that I think will help illustrate some of that.
You have a question on that chart?
This one?
One more on that. You have a chart showing the asset growth over the same 23 years and the liability growth over the same 23 years as the equity growth.
We don't have it here, but we do have those charts.
Is it fairly similar to the chart here?
Yeah, so I think you would find that the growth in the equity is faster than the growth in assets.
By how much?
I don't know. We can get that to you if you want that.
That'd be great, thank
All right. You guys write that down.
The goal is to keep our equity program redeeming on a timely fashion.
Understand that, well, we could see that with the chart.
And, yep. Okay, yeah, this is where we left off, because we already used 45. So remember, we talked about that other chart that Dave talked about with the preferred stock being deducted. So this is the same type of a chart, only we're deducting the preferred stock and the holdback was moved to 25%. So we just grabbed the number 25. What would it have looked like in the past? Remember, these are years past. This is 2000 going through 23. The blue bar is what was actually issued. The green bar is still the hypothetical. And then the orange bar, those never change because that's actual equity redeemed. So here you can see, I don't think, so you gotta go to 23 is the first time we actually redeem more than we issue. There's some years that are 17. The 17 is, yep, we redeem more than we issued there. And we redeem more than we issued there. There's some that are close. As you can see, there's a lot that are still substantially more. And I'm not here, I'm just here to tell you what, I mean, this is what was asked for at the annual meeting, some of these charts. This is just a look back on what, if the board had decided 25% at that time, this is what it may have looked like.
So just to make sure that we are aligned on this, there's some assumptions in this chart. And we're also starting with less than $1 billion of equity at the beginning of this chart. We're starting here today at 5.4 billion of allocated equity. A little different scenario, but we had this question asked to us of what would happen if you would have had this implemented 10 years ago, or Tony, I think you asked for 10 years, but this goes back to 2000.
Can you guys show us the formula you're using to give us confidence that 45% will be used? I mean, you're giving us a chart that shows us 25%, but what are you basing your numbers off of our formula? Is it consistent?
Sorry, I just haven't struggled. What formula are you talking about?
These graphs are strictly, this is the holdback. This is what it would have been if the board held back 25% in those years. That's all this chart is showing.
How is that formula?
So you would take the patronage earnings for the year. And in this case, we would have held back 25% of that to be allocated, plus the preferred stock deduction that we talked about, like interest, preferred stock. So that's how that's calculated. You start with earnings, you pull off and say, well, how much of that was patronage earnings? In this case, now we're pulling off. So we're saying patronage earnings, which also takes out preferred stock. So we take that, whatever's left over. Now we're, instead of last year, we put 10% into the unallocated reserve. In this scenario, we're going to take 25% to put that in unallocated reserve. So is that answering what you're asking?
Roughly, but I mean, moving forward with projections, and I know you can't do this forward looking statements and all that. So we're doing look backs instead of forward looking. But how can you make us confident that you won't use that 45% every year? And I know you say don't get stuck on 45%, but it's a huge pendulum swing going from 10% to 45%.
If I could elaborate a little bit on that question on 10%. When you said up to 10% a while ago, when did you start using the full 10%? Because you've been using that for a while. And we used to be told it was only up to 10% when they originally did that. And under that philosophy, where are we at?
Where it was 2010. So if you think back on why that was, and we always had that provision in our bylaws since 1998. We had a fertilizer issue in 2000, I think it was 2009, right here, Dan. So we had a huge earnings year in fertilizer one year. we allocated a bunch of equity to our owners. And the next year, we had a loss in that same unit. But we didn't have anything in our unallocated reserve that was patronage earnings, because none of it was. So we couldn't pull it out of unallocated reserve to offset the loss the next year. So we had to, our options were slim. What we did was go back to your owners and say, you're gonna have to give us that equity back that we gave you the year before, because we don't have the ability to offset it on our books. That's when we started putting 10% in to try to get a reserve of cushion. So if we have a bad year, we can offset that in certain divisions and not have to go to the broad group and say, give us that money back. That's when it started. And we've been doing 10% since 10 or 11 ever since, to try and provide a cushion to give us a little flexibility in our.
So that's where it creates a concern of up to 45%. Up to is a strong statement. And understandably, if you need, and this is what we talked about at the end of the meeting, if you need more help, that's fine. But an up to is such a broad range. If I was as a farmer, well, I'll spend up to just for my fertilizer and try to keep it laid under, and I have no option, I have to go to it. And that's the option you guys are creating with an up to 45.
Sure, and I understand later, but most cooperatives have up to 100% flexibility. You give the board the tools they need so they can make the decisions.
So a lot stronger or weaker than,
I'm sorry.
are they stronger or weaker than CHS? So co-ops are comparing this.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how you define stronger or weak. I think all of them are successful.
Are we more successful than them?
I think I could answer that.
You look at that chart we showed earlier,
All of those are very large, very successful cooperatives. Our competitors in the marketplace, our peers. All of them are very successful. There's a different philosophy. So you did, and to keep this in mind also that as you look across our trade territory, we have very different philosophies on how a cooperative structure operates. We've heard from this region that you should pass back 100%. Everything should go back to the owners. And that's I've heard that very strongly. As you work to the south, as you work to the east, that changes. You can get into areas in Indiana, Ohio that are extremely strong cooperatives that when you ask them about how do they pay patronage or redemptions, they don't talk about it. They don't do it. They invest everything back in the cooperative. Different model, still successful, different model. Keep in mind, our job as a board is to represent that entire group and have different philosophies. Just like you would ask your board to represent the entire cooperative that you represent. We have to do the same.
Trent, I want to get back to your question just a little bit. So I'm one director out of 17. None of us can sit here and say, well, this is what the board's going to do in the future. But what I will say is, if you look at the chart and you look at every single year and you try to come up with a number that's going to work, there's not one number. So when I look at this from my seat, this chart to me screams flexibility because there is not one number. 45 is not needed in every year. In some years, it may be nice to do that so that we can level the thing out. There's not one set number. And just look at the differences on how close they are in some years, and then the variability when it gets out of control. There's not one number. And that's why I can't stress enough, we're really looking for that flexibility.
So Tracy, if that is the case, then why can't you guys come up with parameters? Because you know the history, right? We can play with history all day long. Why can't you show us where you needed it and where you didn't, and there'll be more money? You just answered that. If you would have had that flexibility, that would have been a lot different. So put that scenario to that chart once and see where we go with it. And then set some parameters so we can feel comfortable for the future.
I'm gonna take a stab at that, Tony. In our research, we look back that same time period. If our only goal would have been to never issue more than we redeemed. So that was a consistent goal each year. But once again, we can't sit here and say that's what board would have done. But if we would have looked at it from that perspective, it's amazing the flexibility within. There are years where there was down to 5%. Were years of 45% wasn't enough. But and last year it would have been only 15%.
Years past, you gave 50% in cash, 50% equity.
Not every year.
But you did. But you did.
There was a few years, yeah. But what I'm getting at is just trying to give you a picture as to how to look if that was the only goal. But as a board member, that isn't your only goal. We also have to make sure we run the company as best we can.
Yes, question.
So talking about goals, and I think we're missing a little bit here. We showed the two numbers, 65 and 66%. Of the representative co-ops that you guys analyzed. Now you don't have to do that. It's fine.
It's good because I went the wrong way.
Yeah, so what I want to know is what is your goal on the unallocated side? You guys want to hit 50% unallocated? You want to hit, because that's going to differentiate how you guys handle every year. What's your percent of unallocated you guys are trying to hit? Your representative ones are 66, 65, you're at 28. What are you guys trying to go from 28 to 50, 28 to 45,
So-
28 to 65?
So to answer, there's two things I'd like to talk about. So first of all, the goal is to try to revolve the equity pool in a timely manner that you feel is a timely manner. Every one of you has a different number, probably that's, now we're talking about cooperative equity. So is that 15 years, is it 20? You say no more than 20. So we want, I don't know what the number is for you, but everybody has a different number. What is that number that gives us a reasonable, that our membership feels good about the revolvement period? That's one of our targets. The other is we've set in an internal guardrail that we will not go with 50%.
Of
We cap it
unallocated.
at 50.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know, because I think that makes a different perspective on how you plan for this. Because you've got a goal of 50 as 7.4 the balance, and then you start rolling that out. You know, so then you're starting to look at how much you're doing. That changes the management structure of what you're doing. And the percents that you're going to do in managing those. Because we're going through the same thing on our local.
Most are.
Yeah, and so this is interesting because we're only at like 12, no, 17%. So we're in the worst position to do this.
And some cooperatives don't have this issue because they have a lot of non-member business. Tony, yours would be an example of a large amount of non-member business that helps solve some of these issues. So we've had some that would say, well, just do more non-member business. But we think our focus should be on our owners and doing business with our owners.
With 50% as your target and 30% of your business coming from non-cap, how are you going to stop the growth of the unallocated reserve at 50%?
We may not.
Then what?
Well, I don't think there's anyone that says we don't want to grow our allocated or unallocated reserve. But that, and I think we're going to find as you go forward, our years of redemption are going to grow for a while as we try to correct this issue. But we're going to manage that pool so it's timely. But it's still likely it grows over a period of time because your company, if the company doesn't grow, then I don't think we should expect it. If CHS grows, then I think you would have some likely expectations.
The shift from allocated equity to unallocated is, I always say it's a byproduct. It's not our goal. Our goal is to redeem your equity in a timely fashion. And so as a byproduct of doing that, we shift over to the unallocated. It's not our goal to get it to 50%. We have an internal guardrail that the board has said we're going to keep it under 50%. It's a byproduct. It's not.
And you may ask, well, why do you think that we've got to revolve at time? Because we're hearing that from our owners. That's very clear. That's not a small measure, it's a large measure. For instance, this year we allocated 500 million. We paid back 500 million, but we allocated 640 million. A lot of that was qualified equity. So you are going to pay taxes on that as you receive that. And so then you'll make that argument that I need to get that paid back in a timely manner because I already paid taxes on that. And that's what we hear consistently throughout our membership. make sure you pay that in a timely manner. Make sure it has some value to me. Otherwise, if I'm gonna get that money today, I'm gonna pay taxes on it today, but you're not gonna give it to me for 50 years. No value. No one.
To that point, I'll just add on a little bit. When we were starting to issue more non-qualified, the challenge was, are we going to get it back? And to prove that we were going to redeem that, we did send out a little bit each year just to prove that point. And then we had people coming back to us and say, forget about that. Give us the allocated equity that we paid our tax on. Don't worry about the non-qualified until it's the years of redemption and it's time to be redeemed. So to Dan's point, yeah, there was a lot of pushback. We want the stuff, the money that we paid the tax on. And that's what our part of our concern as we go forward. We're accumulating all this allocated equity that you're going to pay the tax on. And if you don't get it for 15, 20, 25, 30 years, what's the true value of that dollar when you get it? It just over time, it just becomes less valuable than the day it was issued.
I don't think anybody disagrees that most of us co-ops have been paying a 30-70, but 70 and allocated, paying 30% back in cash, and we're all falling behind. Fact of life, we know how they work. And I think the amount of 45 is where we're going to have a bump against. You tie the 165 or 169 million together with this 45, and I think you got an issue that's going to die. It's only they can pass. And I don't know why you don't split them up and say, let's take the 100, 115, 120 net, whatever it is. Over 10 years, you're talking over $1 billion of savings. You get that start year one, right out the chute, you got that one. Nobody in here's going to kick about that one. And then say, hey, you know what? Maybe 28 or maybe 30 is where we go with the first time with this. You know, let's have something that's realistic.
Say, why do you say that you're concerned about 45? 28, so
When I start looking at those kind of numbers, even if we did it locally like that, we brought it out to our patrons, they'd be like, these are taking a lot of cash out of our pocket. And I realize you're trying to pay up the stuff that's the old stuff that's already on the books. I mean, that's what your goal is. And like you said, it won't affect us for 20 years, so it won't affect me more than likely. But I look at the next generation coming up with management that probably isn't real co-ops in the first place. And it's what you put in my bottom line. I look at the small co-ops that, granted, they shouldn't be living on patronage, but they have for years. They're going to go away. If they're not buying, if they're not getting any patronage back, they're going to go away. Maybe that's the idea. Maybe that's the idea. I don't know. No, that's not the idea. But those are the scenarios you hear.
Is to provide for our owners, right?
Pardon me?
The essence of our business is to provide for our owners.
I would like to think so, yes.
And if we aren't making our owners happy, they're not going to buy from us. Our business goes down the tube, correct?
There's a certain portion that we've seen through the years where, well, you're a small co-op, they don't really cater to you, they don't see a rep for a year. So we know the small ones are kind of like, they're there.
That's operational, and maybe there's some issues there.
Which we agree on that. And I wasn't blaming you guys saying that we had 45%. 20 years from now, you guys won't be on the board. 10 years from now, I probably won't be on the board. The next board will look at that and say, we have needs.
I hear this a lot, and I struggle with it because that board is motivated the same as we are, and that company is motivated the same as our company is today to do the best for the owners, because that's what gets business. If you don't satisfy your owners, if you don't satisfy your customers, they don't come back. You just told me.
Factual.
The motivation is do the thing that provides the best value to the owner. And I think that motivation doesn't change whether I'm on the board or whoever comes in front of you. They still have to have that mindset.
Well, we have a lot better feeling about you guys coming on and addressing these issues with us than we did back a few years ago. We went to the Michigan thing and all the other stuff that we ate that, like Steve said, that's in the past, is we feel really good about this board. You guys are up front with us. You're telling us what your needs are and how to get there. I mean, I think what you're doing today is really a good thing.
One thing I'll add, so I'm in my 6th year on the board. So I'm standing here and I'm asking you for flexibility. I'm asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust the board. If you lower the number, I mean, I'm going to demonstrate over the lifetime that I'm on the board that I mean what I say. I'm going to demonstrate that we do truly want that flexibility. If you lower the number, you tie the hands of the board being able to demonstrate that flexibility. That's why I really would like to keep it at 45. I understand what you're saying. But to truly give the board flexibility, you know, you just lower the number, you just lower the flexibility that we're asking for. Just to get us back on track, I got a couple of slides I'd like to get through. This is great discussion. Thank you very much. This is the same chart. This is the third one, same style, only it's a 35% holdback, and also the preferred stock is deducted. So you can see again the blue and the allocated, or the allocated equity issued and the allocated equity redeemed. I'll point to this year. That's when we make the biggest jump. And we would actually redeem more than we hypothetically would have issued in a year like this. So this is just good information. You guys asked for this, and so this research team did a lot and went back and did these. So I wanted to make sure we pointed that out. And what's the next chart, Dan?
So just before we leave this chart, great to your question, 45 every year. This chart would indicate we don't need that every year. This chart indicates that we need the flexibility though to make those decisions because it changes every year. This question?
Yeah, so 35, 45, 25 really makes no difference. The bottom line is you're taking that away from us from now going forward so that you can pay us back what you owe us previously. That's what's happening. Do you have a set number and written goals as to how current you would like those retirements to be?
No, so we don't. We've talked about that a lot. So do you set a target? Do you say, well, we need this revolvement? Do we need to be at this number? And what we decided again was we don't want to make decisions for the future board because we don't know what they're facing. What we want is for them to make the right decisions and give them the tools to be able to do those right decisions. I have faith that future board will do that. I won't be on the board when they have to make these decisions, but I want to give them some tools that they can do those decisions. You make those right decisions. And I think you're right. It doesn't matter if it's 25, 35, 45. Give them the flexibility to make the right decision.
So let me give you a scenario though. So say you want to be, so 10 years back is where you want to be. So we start this and we go for the next 10 years forward. We do the 45% holdback. Basically, the pattern is the payout is going to be just about all cash. We'll issue hardly any equity to us. We're going to catch it up to where we're 10 years behind. We're going to get to a point under that scenario where we don't even have voting representation because we don't have any qualified equity left in our co-op.
So I think if you paint that scenario, that there could be some truth to that. I don't think the board would want that. The board, this is why this is a curve. It's going to take some time to correct. They're not going to hit this hard and correct it in a couple of years. So
And the other thing is we all sit in our own boardrooms. We deal with exactly the same issues that you do. And we grow ourselves out of bad situations. So don't sit there and tell me that we can't grow our way out of this. We do it in our own co-ops. So you certainly should be able to do it in the one that we own.
So I would argue that I disagree with you. Our history would show that we cannot grow our way out of it. We use preferred stock to pay redemptions for a number of years, about $300 million worth of that. And we continued to pay more cash for a period of years than we were able to generate. I would argue that no, we cannot grow our way out of this. All of the charts that we looked at, scenarios looking forward, shows that growing faster compounds the problem, doesn't solve it.
Maybe you should try growing your way out of the business instead of looking at charts.
How would you suggest we do it differently?
Work at it. Maybe you should have bought a refinery or two.
Would you want us to buy a refinery now?
There's been opportunities and they all worked out pretty good.
The next chart, what do you got next thing? We're almost to the end. So this is the chart that I jumped the gun earlier. I like this chart because I've heard people say, well, you're 15 years out now. They're 15 years out when I so-and-so way back. They're still 15 years out. In the future, they're still going to be 15 years out. And this is the one that I really think points out that we're not 15 years out going forward. So The current redemption point right here is between 08 and 09. And so as you look to the left of that, you can see it's been a lot easier to stay current than what's going to happen in the future. So we call this the mountain of equity that's coming at us. And that's why I would argue that we're a lot more than 15 years out on equity that we're issuing today.
Tracy, the problem with that graph is it doesn't account for equity retirement. And so it keeps growing because it's saying every year we're adding more and more equity.
This is the debt.
It does account for the equity retirements.
Okay, so when you say that we're gonna be decades out, because by my math, 5.2
5.2, 5.4 billion.
billion. So it's 0809. So on that one, we're 13-ish years out.
So our
The
average,
metric at the annual meeting that was used was we used the prior year's retirement and divided that into the total equity. So at that would come at like 10.2 years, 10.4.
so what you're using is that you think we're gonna be able to redeem $500 million every year.
Well, at the annual meeting, the number that was used was 2 years prior equity redemption.
So our average,
I'm just using your formula.
no, I don't know where the formula, that was not a formula that we've used. But the average equity redemption on this chart, I believe, we're about 130 million a year. It was phenomenal in 23, 500 million. If we can do that, that would be great.
I don't think, Tracy, for this chart, it's not 130 because it goes back a lot farther.
Right.
The chart we were using before only went back 10 years.
Right.
So actually, for this chart, it would be a much smaller number. But if you go 10 years back, the average that we paid out was 130.
So how far out are you?
How do you know?
Yeah, we don't know.
Future board's going to pay.
I mean, it's hard.
Are you talking currently? How far out are we?
Yeah.
Right now, we're about 14 years. We're not quite done in 2009. We paid a portion of 2009. What we were implying at the annual meetings, you were the average what we redeemed each year for 10 years. And that amount is approximately 130 million a year. Divide that into 5.4 billion. And that's the number you get. I didn't even want to use the number at the annual meeting because it just blows you away. But if you do the math, it's somewhere between 30 and 40 years.
Struggle is, I'm gonna get your point. So you're saying this orange bar, 500 million, that would make this a little over 10 years, right? That's how you're coming up with that.
Yep.
Well, what if you use this bar?
Yeah,
Or
then
this
you're at 52, and that was the number that I heard at the annual meeting.
And we've had all of those said. We don't know. We don't know what we'll make next year. We don't know what we'll make the year after. Just so to say we're always going to be something. Currently, we're at the 13 years, 12, 13, 10, 15.
In the middle of 2009, we paid a portion of 2009.
14 years. Our likely scenario says that gets larger and larger as we go forward because we are going to hit this large equity shortly. And the likelihood that we can pay 500 million out every year it's unlikely. Yes.
I just had a question. I think my understanding was if you went to 45%, you would not be willing to make an adjustment to the cash percentage paid out. Is that correct? So like typically it could be 30%, 40% cash, the rest in equity. If you were to do this scenario, are you going to stick with 30%, 40%? Because when you say it's not going to affect the cash paid out, well, that's not really a true statement because 40% of 65% is not the same as 35% of 90% that is getting paid. And that's, I think, that's the one thing, and I'm probably in a little bit of the corner where we've done this in our own co-op because we're mostly member owned. Most of our income is coming from a patronage source, so we have to pay it out. I mean, we're in the same boat as you guys. And so Gary and I have ran these scenarios, but where we see it's more palatable is if we were to hold back, if we changed our bylaws, because ours actually mirror yours, and went up to a higher percentage. The sales pitch we've talked about internally is maybe the cash portion has to be higher to save. We're still putting an equivalent portion to the 90% after our 10% pulled back to the unallocated. just so people understand, you're still getting your cash portion. I mean, because I'm in agreement with you, if it's 50 years from now and I'm that old bitter lady in the office, it doesn't matter, but if you're, I mean, because it's like, it's 50 years from now, but that cash going back into the country, because some of that is, we're passing it back to our patrons because they've been doing business the same amount of years that we've been doing business with you. And
You have to pay it.
And I think that's where, when it's, well, it's not gonna affect cash, it will if you don't adjust that, the cash portion.
So I think that maybe we weren't clear on that. So but when we run through the scenarios, we decouple that. So the amount of cash that we pay out to you, like this year, we paid the 500 million redemption, 500 in cash.
Yep.
That was independent of that, what we would have made that decision on the 10% that we held back. The cash decision is based on the cash we generate and the uses that we have for the cash, whether we're growing the company. There was a period of time. In this time frame here, when we came to you and asked you to be patient with us, we had to rebuild our balance sheet. And you were, and we did. We rebuilt our balance sheet. So I think that the decision of how much cash paid is independent of this decision. And I don't think we're clear to you on that. So this year, had we had the option to go to 45, we would have likely still paid the same amount of cash, 500 million in cash package, 500 in equity redemptions. That was the cash that we had the ability, felt like we had the ability to put out. Independent of how it's taxed, independent whether it went out as qualified or non-qualified. Now, we certainly want to keep in mind if we pay out qualified equity, that we pay you enough to pay the tax. So we've been paying out 50%. In the past, in our early history, we had a formula that was based on how much tax we thought you actually paid. And we made sure we paid at least that amount in cash. Now we believe 50% what we're paying now is far above what you probably actually paid.
Right, let's just use the 50% is if we did the 10% unqualified or unallocated, I apologize, unallocated. So you have, and we'll use thousands of dollars, so that way it's easy peasy. And so $900 then is eligible for patronage. And if you went 50%, it was $450 you get in equity and $450 in cash. If the new scenario you're proposing is 45%, that's held back in unallocated, then the cash portion would be $325 going back to the cooperatives if you're doing it at 50%. So that's $125 difference. And you can, I mean, that's just a simple math equation. And I'm just saying, I would suggest if you really are hard stuck on 45, that there would be some secondary guardrail of making sure. I think that's where people are just like, it is going to affect the cash coming out in the country. I understand what you're saying, but the actual like dollar amount will be affected by the 45 or the 35 or the 25, depending on what your percentage is. And that's, I think you're getting some resistance from that.
So just to back up, though, I think what you're assuming is there's a hard and fixed percentage that we were going to pay out, and that is not the case. So I think this would be illustrated here. We had decent earnings here. We didn't feel we were in a cash position to pay out a bunch of cash. Here, we felt we had a cash position that was strong. We paid out a bunch of cash. This was a great year, but this wasn't a bad year either. It was independent of how much we paid or how much patronage earnings we had. We paid out the cash. We either paid it in patronage earnings or we paid it out in redemptions.
You know, maybe with all the brilliant people that you have working on this, and I mean that honestly, not being smart about it, is maybe you should tie that 45% or 35% to the cash. We're gonna hold back 35 or 45, then the cash portion of pulling up the country will be X. So that way you kind of, you guys want more, then we get more cash. You know, because I mean, you guys have got actuaries that can go in there and they can run numbers a lot better than we can run numbers. But that's what her and I did. Said, well, if we're going to keep this much back, maybe we got to pay out this much more cash. That's palatable to our patrons.
So,
and if you kind of happens so that one's tied to the other, it's going to keep you guys in a better trustworthy position because we know we're going to get a amount of cash back. If that goes up to 45, you got to bump our cash portion up.
get the point. I think maybe, if you think about the fishbone chart, where you start with earnings, and then 70% of that is patronage earnings. Okay, so what you're saying is, well, that's going to be reduced by preferred stock, which it is. So our earnings now is going to be reduced by 120 million on our patronage earnings. So it does affect the earnings, but it doesn't affect the ability for us to pay cash. We still have the same ability to pay cash. We could pay a higher percentage, we could pay more in redemptions, but the ability for us to have that cash available has not changed by doing this. Well, I think your point, I think what you're saying, if you would like us to have some fixed rule, maybe that says, well, if you're going to pay, we've not put as much in the allocated reserve, then we pay a higher percentage of that.
No,
Of our
I said if you put more in your unallocated. 25, 35, 45, as you step it up and take whatever your portion you want to take, then that's gonna be locked into how much more cash we get instead of building your equity. That's what we're saying. That makes it easy to say, okay, we put it at 45.
You take that, let's take $1 billion, because that's a number that's roughly ours. 70% of that's patronage, $700 million is patronage. We're going to reduce that now by 120 million, so $580 million of patronage earnings. Whether we take 10%, 0%, 45% of that, and shove that into unallocated, doesn't matter. We still pay on the earnings that we have that was patronage earnings, upon cash. That's what you get allocated. So the preferred stock does affect it, but the 45, 10%, that doesn't affect how much 13 get in cash.
We truly,
Until you get through all this equity. Then it does in the future.
the cash that CHS pays, this is where, I mean, this is not.
You're losing us in weights a little bit on this one.
So it truly is what we can afford. It's not tied to a percentage. The number, Dan, if we had the official up here, the number that we pay back in cash, it kind of comes floating in because it's not tied to anything. It's truly a number that we can afford. And I know that a lot of people don't like to hear that because they think that they're getting paid last. I can tell you, on a year like this, you should love it. Because we made good earnings, but for the amount that we paid back, we were in a tremendous cash flow position. That's why we could pay back $1 billion. So on a year like this, it was awesome. It truly is what we can afford. It's not tied to a percentage.
So if you guys have been here, a lot of you have been here a long time, so we used to do exactly what you're talking with the formula. So that may create some confusion. You guys know as well. So we used to take our patronage earnings, we would reduce it by the amount that we pay in dividends for preferred stock and the amount we pay in taxes. Whatever's left, we're going to allocate that exactly to our owners in an exact percentage. And then we're going to pay out 45% of that, or 35. I think the last we were, it was 35 or 40%. We had a formula-based process. And that's what we used up until 2016. And then we decided that was not a great approach. We got to manage our business, we got to manage our balance sheet. We're not going to use a formula. We're going to use what we can afford to pay in cash. And that's why you see these swings, because during this period of time, we couldn't afford it. This period of time, we were trying to rebuild our balance sheet and trying to get ourselves in a good position. We thought this time it was time for you to pay you back for this tough times where you guys stuck with us. Yes.
I think there's maybe some lack of clarity between what you call cash and what we're considering cash. I get that when you show that there's no change in cash to you, and there isn't, but when you show that it's just in a different bucket for you. When we're talking about the cash that we get or what we can share with them, we're talking about the total equity payment to us, whether it's in qualified, non-qualified, or cash. That's what we're talking about when you do the two of them together and the 45 preferred stock. The net effect, if you do that fishbone, we're coming down to the net effect coming back to us of all combined revenue sources coming to us end up being about 40% of what we get under today's system. That's our concern, and I don't think you understand that.
So if that's how you define cash, then we're talking different terms.
And I think in the room, that's part of the problem that we're going back and forth here. We're not debating how much actual cash check is coming to us. We're talking about the whole payment that comes to us, that's returned to us.
So then in that case, if you were saying how much is going to be paid to you, cash, dollars, check, how much is going to be allocated to you that we will pay some future year way over here, the dollar amount is less.
And it's drastically less.
It could be drastically less.
So, Tracy, I have a question to you, hard to follow on that, but you made the comment about the board number. What's your board number?
So 17 directors, I'm 1 out of 17.
Right, so, your board is way different than the boards in North Dakota. We're fully producer controlled. All of us can be voted off with 51%, all of us. On your board, North Dakota only has 3 ability to vote, 3 off, if we so choose. And it's a different scenario. We're the producers, we're producer controlled. We have control of our boards because we can vote them off. We can't do that with everybody on the.
But the membership
You
can.
know, only sections, only areas can vote each one of you off. And some areas that don't look at the equity like North Dakota does. They look at equity different because that's their model. The reality is our equity is what we're trying to protect, but we're also trying to prevent our producers' right of control. That's how CHS was formed, 2% exchange. That's what we're trying to protect, because if we maintain our control, we also maintain our equity in the vote.
So why is it any different? I'm not following. I don't mean to be rude. I just don't understand what you're saying.
I know that we don't know how the board votes. I know that you guys will be voting down the road in the next few months before whether it's going to be on bylaw changes coming. But it doesn't matter what our North Dakota caucus does if the rest of the CHS board votes the way they want to vote, that it directly affects us. Now, if our Horizon board decided to do something that was, even if we weren't in full agreement and we decided to go forward, our members could give it all of us. We can't do that. We don't have that full control. And so what you're telling us is you're taking our patronage that our voters are expecting us to fight. And you're telling us that somebody else that doesn't really use our model is going to vote it in and take it away. And we will lose in the state of North Dakota a large amount of revenue. And it's the wrong platform. We don't understand 10%. We understand if you need to move it up. Listen, we will support the survival of CHS. We would support if we had full trust in way more volume of business. We hardly do in our co-op hardly any grain and any fertilizer for CHS. Why should we be doing it? We should be plummeting money into the survival, but not at the penalty of the growers that help build. Am I fair on that?
Well, so you control the percentage of the board that you own of the company. I mean, I think it's only fair. So if you have somebody in Minnesota that they own 10% of the company, they can control 10% of the board. I mean, is it fair for you with the 20% ownership in CHS to control everything that the CHS board does? That's not fair either. I mean, our governance is, well, it might not be perfect. It is fair and equitable. I mean, I think North Dakota is around just shy of 20% of ownership. And you got 3 directors. And that's 20% of the board. I get it. I'm not real quick on the
But
matter.
I'm going to eliminate that voting ability by running it here 45%. You will phase it out like we discussed. You will phase out that producer control. And with your ABC platform that has been put into bylaws, which is not all producer control. If they change it, then you could clearly, but you only have the A category that is producer control. And you will eventually reach the point that no producers are in control. It'll be a ABC formula. And we will lose our equity that we've invested, our risk that we have invested. And I'm using my voice representing the growers that build our co-op and help build the business. And I'm using that voice to say that.
Well, I just disagree. I don't see how you can say we lose producer control. We are producer control. Doesn't matter whether we do this or not. The votes are still owned by the producers, the co-ops that do business with us. That doesn't change. So I disagree with you. I don't think that's accurate. And you can try to explain it, but I don't think that's accurate.
But it's,
I'll clarify a little bit. I believe what he's talking about is an allocated portion that we can put our name on and say, we own this percentage of the company. Whether it's Verizon Resources, or this whole room, or whoever, that number is going to decrease because of the increased holdback. That's what he's saying.
but it's relative to everyone. It doesn't single out your co-op. It doesn't single out this region. It implies to everyone with this. So
And that's still a problem.
but it'll be the same, no matter where you live, what co-op you work with, and who you are, it'll be the same. It'll be the same, as you're looking at it, as you're conveying it, it's not gonna make it any more negative for you than it is for any other co-op. Yes,
So, but like I said earlier, if you go 15 years from today, you go back 15 years and starting tomorrow, give you a 45% holdback and you basically are issuing zero qualified equity. 15 years from today, nobody owns equity in this company.
Oh, yeah.
Is that a good thing?
no, that's not the goal. And that's not the way this is gonna work out. If that was the case, I mean, there's even co-ops in regions close by that have unlimited holdback capabilities. If we went and challenged them and talked to them today, I think they'd be pretty convincing that they still have their owners. They still have owners with their names on this equity. So that doesn't change. Yes, sir.
I think we're losing sight of a couple of things here because we've got co-ops right now that are high energy co-ops. And they have 90% unallocated reserve. Do they still have, is all the control gone? I don't think so. There's still people voting. 60%, there's still people voting, there's still allocation. Even at 45, I'm not condoning anything, but even at 45% holdback, there's still going to be an allocation of some dollars. You're not eliminating everything, correct?
Correct.
There's always going to be allocation. Your target is 50% unallocated. Again, not condoning anything. I'm not looking for pitchforks here. What I'm saying is, I think we're losing sight of this whole 45% deal and the flexibility because we just went through a bylaw situation. Same situation, give the board flexibility for managing capital. And that's what we're talking about, how to manage capital within a co-op. Everybody is different. There is no concrete pattern from Enerbase to Horizons to a little local that we run. Everybody does it different. But everybody still has a voice. There's always going to be allocation, correct? You guys are not eliminating allocating anything else.
The voting formula. The formula between, you get votes for equity and you also get votes for sales. That formula, vote formula has been in place exactly the same for, I don't know if it's from the creation of CHS, but for a long, long time. The vote formula doesn't change. It's sales and equity.
Say it again, please.
It would be higher leverage for sale after 15 years of this program.
Or whenever this current equity is redeemed, however long that takes.
So the large reason,
You're assuming we're going to maximize it to the hill.
We're not.
History is showing up.
And you know, you keep,
We had 10% option since the inception of this cooperative.
and it wasn't
We
enough.
did not do it. It's not any.
I'd like to share this story. Through this process, we visited with a lot of people, and I recall a manager that we visited with, and he said, when he took the job, their situation was much like ours now. And they implemented a no limitation as to what he could hold back. And I forget, I think it was 20 some years. And this year he said, we didn't hold back anything. To me, that would be the optimum goal from my perspective, Dave Johnson's perspective, that we get this under control so that we don't have to hold much back. So that we can be current, as much more current than we are, and we return the cash, as much cash as we can. That would be, to me, the ultimate goal. But it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time.
I think my concern is, like you said, the way the votes are figured, tabulated is 15 years out, whatever years out, we finally get a lot of that equity burned down. You're gonna have just the large, huge co-ops, the grain co-ops, or whatever else, they're gonna control the votes. It's based on sales and on equity, correct?
So, yeah, it is sales and equity. So I have seen that this isn't part of the deck. We haven't dove into this, but I'm chair of the governance committee, and we have looked at that. And our sales, our votes has grown more and more to equity and away from sales.
And then now it has, but then going forward, as I said, going forward 15
They
years,
change.
it's gonna reverse that in the big co-ops. So all the little co-ops are built, and I say little, think whatever little is 80 million down or whatever the number might be, is as their equity burned up and gone, their voting rights in CHS will be diminished greatly compared to the large co-ops that have sales or purchases through CHS, correct?
Shooting from the hip, because I don't have the data in front of me, I think it would take a number of years to even get it back to where it was. Because we've drifted pretty dramatically more towards equity.
And I'm not disagreeing with that, I'm saying down the road, we're talking 15 to 20.
And at that time, if the board saw an issue, they could change with the bylaw. You could change the.
But then the companies that are large are gonna control the voting. So I mean, they're not gonna give it back to the small guy, I mean, sell that one any day of the week.
There's a question on the chat. Let's take that.
Well, the cap of 50% included in the bylaw.
No, currently there's not.
I guess I have a question. I think everyone realizes something probably needs to be done. We can see the charts, we can see the amount of funds, we can see that. The question I have is, do you have any concerns about loss of revenue because of this? That there's going to be a certain amount of co-ops and or patrons that say, why should I keep patronizing CHS? As if down the road, our young producers are not going to be able to get their equities the way we have. Loyalty is a problem the way it is, especially with the younger producers. So have you thought into that there could be a loss of revenue?
Well, that certainly is a potential. Like, it'd be a sad day that if we came to that. But I would also argue the fact that wouldn't that young producer, because I've been farming with an nephew. None of us that sit in this position don't farm with somebody. There's just a lot of work to be done. So I farm with a nephew. And his perspective is that immediate gratification. What can I get today? And I'd like to, in my mind, that younger producer, if he can get that equity revolved quicker, and so he gets the value of that dollar before the inflation eats it up, is going to have a good value as well, rather than saying, here's X amount. You may not get it for 25 years or X amount of years. What's that worth to him at that point after evaluation has eaten up that face value in that time period? Younger producers just think that way, at least the ones that I'm around.
I think you also might, I would say just the opposite. I'm worried if we don't do something, we're gonna lose people. We're gonna lose customers. We're gonna lose loyalty because they're saying you're not revolving our equity. This patronage system you have doesn't have any value to me anymore. We're gonna go somewhere else. I worry just the opposite. If we don't solve something, do something to correct this, we're gonna lose people.
Okay, question on the chat. Have you looked at the net present value of making this change?
So the net present value would be assuming that we project into the future. Wow. We probably can't, none of us can. It would be hard to make a judgment, I think, on a net present value calculation. I think the reality is that our Our goal is to evolve it within the time we have, trying to manage that. That's our target, that's our projections, what we're trying to do. Trying to put a value on that would be quite difficult. Because you're gonna have to make a whole bunch of assumptions that we don't have. Just like these.
Yeah, you had the data that suggests this was a problem for quite a while, you know, these 12 years, taking that huge charge there. Was there any discussion back in 2012 about that? The reason that we turned to put it down at that point, so we didn't.
So we've had, so I was. He's the longest serving board member, but we've had these discussions for a number of years.
And looking back, so it's clear.
I'm sorry.
I'm just saying, looking back, it's always clear to look back and say this is back when it changed. I'm just looking at that chart saying, you know, that this has been happening for quite a while. And that's.
And so, you know, and we did take some actions. So we used preferred stock to enhance our cash position by using preferred stock to redeem. That was one of the actions we took. And if you also remember back, I don't know, it was 12 or something like that, we came to you with a proposal of using non-qualifieds and putting them in a long-term position, long-term equity. This region actually pushed back on that and said they didn't want that. But we were suggesting using non-qualifieds to extend that term, get a name on that equity, but extend the term of the redemption to give us some cash flow freedom. We brought that to the owners. And much like this process right here, this region actually is the one to push back on it. And we decided not to do that, not to use that tool. So there was discussion throughout that whole thing.
You know, the other thing I'll say is if you go back in time, you know, it's always easy to say, well, you should have done this. The equity balance wasn't nearly as high back then. You know, the equity balance now is 5.4 and is growing very, very dramatically. So, you know, if you start stair stepping this up, you know, it's not crazy to say, well, you could be at $10 billion in a number of years. I don't think that was clear if you would have gone back 15 years.
No, I was to say the last.
Right.
You know, it was discussed, but until a couple of years ago, when we brought in an outside capital structure people to take an outside look at it and really conveyed what we were suspecting, it really drove it home. And we needed to do something.
But it's not a simple task. It takes years to plan. And obviously a lot of communication, pushback from you, our owners in areas. So we don't take it lightly. It's a tough thing to try to wait on. Yes.
You have a goal now for a certain time table or period of years where you want to allocated equity redeem 10 years, 5 years, 8 years, where do you want to catch that up to?
We have discussed that at length. We've decided is we want to put a target on a future board to say this is what it has to be. We believe the number has to be somewhere around where we're at, reasonable. But every one of us has a different opinion of what that is. So we want that future board to try to figure out what our owners want at that time. But we believe that we want to stay somewhat current to where it is. This weekend we've talked about this. Do you put a whole bunch of restrictions on a future board? You guys serve on the board. Would you want that? I don't think our boards want that. I think what you want is to trust in that board to do the right thing, give them the tools, give them the information, and they do the right thing. I don't want to put that restriction on that board. I want that board to try to make the right decisions.
Yes. You know, at the end of the day, you're trying to get the unallocated reserve to grow. Why aren't you looking at non-patronage based business development kind of in a merit form rather than increasing holdbacks?
So did everybody hear that question?
Repeat the question.
So why don't we grow non-patronage business to solve some of this issue? There's 2 points to this. First of all, that doesn't solve our allocated. We still have to pay the allocated back to continue to grow that. Second is we believe our focus should be on our owners. Patronage business is the focus part of what we do for our owners. We have some non-pat that is not, that you could consider maybe ancillary to patronage to our owners. But we've had the discussion in the boardroom that we believe our focus should be on our owners. And if we're going to look at growth opportunities, we're going to look at those opportunities and bring new value and not just try to do something that creates dollars. And I believe that's what our owners are telling us. I believe that's what they want from us. We've heard that pretty loud. And that's why we, yeah.
And if we ever were to look at it, if an opportunity presented itself, it would have to be core to what we're doing. We don't want to get into a business that we're unfamiliar with. It's got to be core. Yes, sir.
That's the case. The CHS not pay patronage to non owner through LLC.
We have an LLC program. It has to be a program where the owner is the cooperative.
Majority owner.
They get a percentage of their patronage. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but because I've gone through this a bunch, but they get a percentage of their patronage based on their ownership. That's cooperative or no. Is that correct?
Right, but it doesn't have to be a majority,
Then 20%.
20%. And to your, I think I know where you're going with this. The total within that 5.4 billion is like 3%. Approximately 3% of that total is equity, that's allocated equity that's went to those types of business units.
So we're getting the poll here. She gets closer and closer every. So we're gonna wrap this up really quick, if that's okay. So just this was some comments on what happens if we don't do anything, that we might erode. We talked about this, we can erode the value of our patronage program if we don't do anything. The time to redeem our equity just gets longer and longer. We think that even if we do this, the time to redeem is likely to get longer for a period of time, and then it gets shorter. Hopefully it's a curve that we can manage. We could at some point say that if we have too much equity that has to be redeemed, our banks could look at that and our capital sources and say, you have a huge liability on your balance sheet. We're concerned about that. The bylaw amendments are available online. I have them here in an appendix, but if you want to see them, but the bylaw amendments are available online if you just want to study them. They're very simple. As you think through the process now, we're going to go into these meetings. We've got a number of these meetings to do. All the regions have meetings like yours, so we're going to do these meetings to try to educate. We're going to have our town halls in the summer, another opportunity for you to come and listen and provide feedback to that. We're going to bring this to you at the 2023 annual meeting as a bylaw amendment. That's it. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Comment about view this like that. So does the board view the preferred stock and the qualified equity? You view that as a net?
I do. And I think, Mr. Chairman, correct me, but I look at it as debt. We're using somebody else's money. We're paying a dividend, or in my opinion, it's interest. Some others don't call it debt. They look at it differently, but I truly believe it is. And I think each one of us probably wants to look at it differently, but I think it's debt.
How do you report it on the 10K?
It is equity.
Equity.
Why would you report equity?
That's the way accounting rules provide it for us, require for us to report it. It's not like it's our decision.
FASB rules require that we report this as equity. There's equity in their eyes, and it's an equity structure, a capital structure that looks like common stock and preferred stock of any other company, so we have to report it. That is what it is. It's equity on our balance sheet. But we believe that the dividend that we pay is interest-like, no different. It's an obligation that we have to pay to use somebody's money.
Good thing about preferred stock, you don't ever have to pay it back technically, as long as you keep paying that dividend. But it doesn't, it gets marked down as an equity. So it doesn't hurt our ratios. Believe me, I'm sure, I'm no preferred stock expert. It's an avenue that a lot of companies use to grow the company because of the way it's handled on the balance sheet.
So the way originally it was accounted for, is that for tax reasons, it's not, now we want to convert it to an expense item, basically. For that, why was it handled that way?
Would you repeat that?
Why was the preferred stock dividend treated the way it's been treated as a dividend and not calculated in the patronage calculation.
Okay. So it's a good question. I try to shorten it up. FASB rules, it's treated as a dividend. Dividend is not deductible as an expense for the corporation. Tax rules are the same. The difference is that patronage, the way we calculate patronage has flexibility. And there is some rulings by the IRS that we have the flexibility to go either way on that. We originally set that up to be what it is today. We're suggesting now that it's different. There's a flexibility on the pattern, the way you use patronage.
We're at a hard 45. There's no compromise. There's no 25. It's 45. Hard.
We haven't made that decision as a board yet. We're still listening.
So it's still in the air.
It's still in you.
And with that, I'd like to thank them all. I know there's more that we'd like to discuss with them, but let's actually take a 10-minute break. And then we will hear from Dennis Carlson about his member update. So 10-minute break for everybody. And we're going to try to fix our audio with Zoom as well.
Something.
Dennis will be on soon. Can you guys hear me in the chat? Hear me online?
You get this mic on. Okay, if we can get started. Everybody's got an eye on the road, so we want to kind of try to get everybody home safe and sound today. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to visit with you a little bit today. I'm going to present a little bit different opinion. Yeah, stand on this side. Technology never did like me.
Just testing.
Well, anyway, I want to thank the three gentlemen from CHS that came out here today and gave their presentation. I thought they did a really good job, and we've worked together many times over the years, and I have a great deal of respect for all three of you. Want to also thank the three directors from North Dakota for their participation. And again, a great deal of respect for you guys. Can we get it to click or not? I'm going to give a slightly different perspective. I actually am probably look at the world differently. I think allocated equity is a good thing. I think it's a sign of a successful cooperative. And I think, you know, in a perfect world, you stair step allocated equity as you go along. And again, I understand there's issues in terms of how fast can you redeem the allocated equity. And there's a net present value calculation that gets involved as far as what's the real value to the members. So I want to be very clear that I'm speaking today as a member, a producer member of CHS. I'm not speaking as a past director or anything. But this really is a member issue. This is not an issue that the board of directors is in charge of. At the end of the day, it's up to the members. And I want to make sure that the members can hear both the pros and the cons, as well as the truth. This should be a search for the truth. When we talked, Steve was up visiting, talking about, you know, we gotta come together on trust and things like that. And I think that's a really good point. We can have our own opinions, and we should have our own opinions. That's what's the strength of the cooperative system.
But what we should do is center on facts. We're not entitled to our own set of facts. We have to try to agree to the extent that we can on facts, cold, hard numbers. And from that, we should form our opinions. Now, I'm going to show a few different numbers that probably look at the world a little differently than what you just saw. But again, I want to be very clear. I'm speaking not as a past board member. So when you talk about cooperatives, cooperatives are different. You can't really compare one co-op to the other as much as I think sometimes we do. So CHS is different than your local co-op. One local co-op is different than the other, and they have different cultures. I think Dan and Tracy talked about the different culture in your world in North Dakota, and it is what it is. And I don't think there's any right or wrong. I don't think this is an issue about what's right or wrong. I had a producer here today say to me, ask me a question. He said, Dennis, what should be the amount of allocated equity in CHS? And I started going on my spiel about, well, CHS is different, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's your company. It's up to you. But the question that I want you to think of is, okay, we're here today speaking to CHS. And if you want to take CHS where it is today and you want to move it to a different place, a different paradigm, you've got to ask a couple basic questions. One is, where are we going? It's just like taking a trip. Where are we going? How fast are we going to get there? Are we going to drive or are we going to fly? And here's the big one. Who's going to pay the price? Who's going to pay if we're going to drive? Who's going to pay the gas money? If we're going to fly first class, who's going to pay for that? So when I hear that it's going to take all these years to redeem the equity that's on the books today, that tells me that an entire generation of ag producers, if those numbers are correct, I don't think they are, but if they are, that tells me that an entire generation of ag producers will have to pay this price. They're going to have to put up either the gas money or the plane ticket. So think about that in terms of the trip. Who should pay for it? And what is that going to cost? And is the utopia at the end going to be worth it? Those are the questions that you have to ask. Now, again, co-ops are different. So I have electric co-op that I do business with. They think of themselves as a nonprofit co-op. They proudly proclaim that they're nonprofit. So when I write a check to them for $600 to buy electricity, it probably, excuse me, if their cost is $600, I probably have to write the check for about $605. So I don't get too hung up over what their patronage program is. Because it's only $5. And because guess what? My closest neighbor is 2 miles from me and I live 23 miles from a town. So the competition isn't really beating the doors down saying, Dennis, we want to bring electricity. But CHS, I think, thinks of themselves. I'm getting ahead of myself. CHS thinks of themselves as a for-profit co-op. And I hope I'm not saying something that isn't true, but they sell this. I'm going to use fertilizer as an example. So they sell fertilizer at a market price. So if in the case of this electric co-op, I paid $605 for that $600 what it cost the co-op to give me this electricity. But with CHS, I write out a check at market price. So let's say that the price of a ton of fertilizer is $700. But it only costs CHS $600 to get that ton of fertilizer. Okay. So that $100, that pre-tax income, of course, is what we're talking about today. Who should get it? How should they get it? How does this work? And how should it work? Call me old-fashioned, but I actually think that the person that wrote out the check for the $700 is the one that should have the main claim when it's all said and done to that $100. I don't think it should be somebody in the future that either cashes that in in some way, shape, or form. I think it should be, I think the goal of the board of directors should be, how can we combine what's best for CHS to use that money for a period of time and then get the residual back to the owner, the person that actually wrote that check. So I want you to think about this. This is a rhetorical question. What percentage of a business's total annual earnings should be returned to the owners in cash? We would all like to reinvest in our businesses every single dollar. It'd be kind of fun, wouldn't it? When I bought my farm, I paid $285 an acre for the first 5 quarters that I bought. And I would have loved a few years later to bought another couple quarters. I would have loved to have better equipment over the years. But I had this little thing called, family living expenses that I had to draw from my farm: food, shelter, clothing. So the question then is, whether it's your farm, whether it's a co-op, whether it's a publicly traded company, whether it's a hair salon on Main Street, the question is, how much cash is appropriate to pull out of a business? And I think it's fair to ask of these directors today, because they have investments in businesses, how do they view how much cash they pull out of their businesses? So they have an investment, for example, Ventura Foods, and I have no idea. I don't remember. I'm sure I was told once, how much cash do you pull out of Ventura Foods? I mean, I think what's good for the goose is good for the gander, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure Ventura Foods would like to grow. I'm sure they have things that they would like to invest in. The point is that owners, they have cash needs as well. In growing the enterprise value is great. I have shares in publicly traded companies, and they have different perspectives. I have one company that I invest in, and they're a large company, they're a commodity company, a lot like CHS. And they have this idea that we want to return as much cash as we can back to you. They still want to grow, but they really return a lot of cash. They buy back shares and they pay good dividends. I have investments in other publicly traded companies that they have the perspective, we're going to keep it all internally because we're really growing. But in a publicly traded company, when the enterprise value of the company grows, guess what? It doesn't matter to me because I get it either way, right? I get, on the one, I'm getting cash dividends, but on the other one, I am getting an increase in the share value. The co-ops don't work that way, do they? So I know that this is 30,000 foot level, kind of basic for everybody, but I think sometimes it's good to get up at that 30,000 foot level. Hopefully we don't hit any Chinese balloons up there, but I think for me anyway, this topic can get so complicated. We could spend 2 days here talking. But sometimes it's helpful, at least for me, to picture it at a really simple level. So we got 3 players in the patronage value chain. We got the cooperative, we always think about that. We got the member, we always think about that. But there's Uncle Sam the tax man, and Uncle Sam gets his cut. But just like on an operational side of a business, it seems to me that it'd be prudent to operate in a tax efficient manner. Now, you don't just go with, you don't build your whole model around tax efficiency, but it would seem prudent that you'd want to operate in a tax efficient manner as much as you can. And there's one influencer that I call, and that's Father Time. And Father Time is so important when we talk about patronage. That's why your chart, no offense guys, but that's why your chart, the conclusions that you came up with are wrong. And they're wrong because you haven't put in Father Time. And what I mean by that is when you say that you're issuing more equity than what you're redeeming, remember, the expectation is that that's not going to get redeemed for 15, 18 years. USDA, the most recent number that I can find, they said that the average redemption period on farmer co-op equity is 18 years. That's the average. I don't know, maybe there's some, you never know how dated that information is, but I've seen that in several cases where it says the average is 18 years. So we'll get to that in a minute. There's 3 requirements to participate in this value chain. So as a member, I want you to picture again, going back to this $700 a ton fertilizer that you bought. And I want you to picture $100 bills. And there's a room like this room that's got a huge table on it, and it's got all these $100 bills in it. And that's the $100 of pre-tax income from each ton of fertilizer that CHS sold. What do you do to get into that room? Well, the first thing you do is you sign a consent form, right? And that consent form says that you as a member are willing to pay income taxes that the cooperative passes back to you. Sometimes I think we take for granted how big of a deal that is. Now, Uncle Sam, IRS, they give us a minimum, they give us a backstop of saying, well, you got to get at least 20% cash for that. So there's a little bit of backstop. The co-op usually likes to pay a little bit more than that if they're going to send the tax obligation back to you. Okay, so that gets you to this table with all this money, and you're sitting there, but what gives you a share of the money? Well, it's a book of business, right? It's the fact that you wrote out that check for $700. You can have $1 of equity in CHS, or you can have 10 million. The money you're going to get back is based upon that book of business that you bought. The more tons, the more claim that you have to it. And the third thing is you've got an obligation to capitalize the cooperative for a period of time. That's one of the reasons why I use fertilizer as an example. Guess what? It took a lot of money to capitalize that fertilizer LLC, right? You had to have a lot of money. So CHS took your equity, they borrowed against it, they issued preferred stock in conjunction with it, and they swung the deal. And every year when you buy a ton of fertilizer, that depreciation is in that first $600. So when you talk about doing things to provide service or goods or whatever for you, the member, guess what? When you write that check, that first $600 covers that depreciation. It covers everything for that given year. There's no free rides. You're going to have to pay for that, right? So here's a net present value chart. And what I did here is I took the CHS preferred stock dividends. And yes, their interest, with all due respect, guys, excuse me, their dividends, they're not interest-like. They're dividends. And I took that and said, what if that was a discount rate? So the discount rate would be 7.4513%. And I don't want anybody to get hung up. We can argue all day long about whether the discount rate should be 3%, 5%, 7%, 9%, or anything in between, right? But what this shows, and on the other side, I got 5%. This shows then that if you're a member and you're waiting for your equity to get redeemed to you, that after 15 years, for example, you're going to get from 34 to 48 cents. And that's typically, that top line would be typically a number that would seem, I think, to most of us, a reasonable amount of time. And again, the lower the interest rate, the more you get, the higher the discount rate, you would get less, you would get less money with the higher discount. So I did 50 years at that rate, and it came out to 2.75 cents. But here's where it's important to understand. So this discount, as the CHS board has explained, that applies to your equity into the future, right? But that's not all it applies to. If the co-op wants to take this new money that they're talking about, and they want to invest in maintenance capital and growth capital, we've heard those presentations. If there's no new money, if there's no new money until the current equity is redeemed, and I've heard that, and maybe I've heard it wrong, but it seems like I've heard that. If there's no new money until the equity is redeemed, guess what? That's gotta go through that discount rate, doesn't it? So when you think about purchases or assets that you're gonna buy, I mean, you're gonna get pencil sharpeners and hubcaps for your new service vehicles. That's what you're gonna get. Because it's gonna be 3 cents on the dollar. I mean, that's cold hard math. So unless there's new money right up front, it's gotta go through this chart. The cooperative also, and this seems to be disputed, the cooperative benefits by the passage of time. So this burden, I think I heard it referred to as a mountain of equity. This burden really isn't a mountain. You know why? Because of the passage of time. Because again, the cooperative will take this equity and they will borrow against it. They will issue preferred stock in conjunction with it, and they will make investments. And those investments, if they're prudent, will give you a return. You see, the way the cooperative model works is when you redeem past equity, you're using future earnings. How do you get future earnings? It's a future return on future assets. So unless you model this out and say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future, here's what I think my future assets are. Here's what I think my future return on those assets are. And this is the net profit. How can you calculate anything? How can you come up with any sort of projection? So when I hear this, wow, in the past we've redeemed X number of dollars, so then therefore, that's going to mean that, oh, it's going to be a long redemption period. That's simply faulty math. I mean, we could go back, and I'm going to show you 24 years ago when CHS first started. But we could go back 90, 95 years, the Senex and Harvest States. This is not a Christopher Columbus moment that all of a sudden something's unsustainable. I'll bet you, I don't know because I don't have the records, but I'll bet you that the allocated equity has grown ever since then. I'll bet you that the amount that allocated was always greater on a year-to-year basis than what was redeemed. And I just don't understand the thought process. I mean, if you're going to do, we talked about Dave having some experts that confirm this. I mean, how can an expert confirm unless you actually did the forward-looking, say, okay, this is what our assets are, this is what the return's going to be, this is how much we're going to earn, and we're going to apply it back in time, 15, 18 years, whatever that is. I mean, it's Co-op 101. So, yes.
Yes, you're spot on the schedule of all of us. And we know it's considered something. How are we gonna do it? We're gonna make this money. From your point of view, there's some reason that this really this
And I'll get to that. Thank you. That's a good question. I'll show you. None of us, I think Dan said, or whoever, none of us have a crystal ball. None of us know for sure what the future holds, right? So, but I think my expert is Father Time. My expert is, this has worked for 95 years. I haven't heard why this no longer works. I would think that'd be the first thing you'd have to say. Well, yeah, this has worked for 95 years between Senex and Harvest States. But now, this is what has changed. And I haven't heard that. But we're going to get into the actual numbers. So what does CHS want to do? Well, it's pretty obvious. They want to take income that would ordinarily go into the allocated side and they want to put it into the unallocated side. That comes across loud and clear. Why do they want to do it? That's where it gets a little confusing. So I hear two basic things. CHS wants to grow. Well, that makes sense. I don't think anybody's opposed to that. And that the current patronage program is unsustainable. Well, we're gonna see about that. But doesn't it seem a little odd that, again, if I'm wrong, I want these guys to correct me, but what I'm hearing is until this equity's paid off, there's no new money. I mean, am I wrong in that? Did anybody else hear that besides me? Because I think that's what I heard. So if there's no new money, then it's gonna take decades and decades and, do the math, it's 36 to 54 years. Because I did the math, that's what I came up with. So if you have this dam,
Yes, Mr. Respond, or yes, just a question. We have never said
you never said what?
that there's no new money. I mean, we're getting that. We've never said,
Okay, so where does the new money come from?
I don't know what you mean by new money, but we have never said that no new money will continue to allocate equity, continue to pay back. We have never said anything different.
So now you're saying then that there will be new money because there's only so many dollars, and if the cash is the same. If the cash is the same, where does the new money come from?
Again, yes, I think you're assuming that we're gonna max this out and that we're not gonna pay out enough cash to override anything. So I think you're assuming something that we have never said.
Okay, well, we'll get into that details a little bit later on that. So now I'm hearing that there is gonna be some new money. Well, where's the new money gonna come from? There's only one place that the new money then could come from. And I think that's a whole different discussion. Again, we think about these three players sitting around the table. You got Co-op, you got the member, and you got Uncle Sam. So if CHS is going to get more money up front, who's going to take the hit of those three players? Is it because you're telling the members they're going to get the same money up front, right? Am I correct in that? Okay, so if the members are going to get the same money, I don't think Uncle Sam's going to take less. So how does that work? I mean, that's why it helps to go and think about it as three people sitting around the table. If you're taken from one, I mean, little kids can, they maybe think about it in terms of cookies or candy, but if you got three people sitting there and one gets more, there's less for the other two. It's an inescapable fact. And if you're going to take more, is Uncle Sam going to take less?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're assuming that there's more money. There's not more money. It's just allocated different spots.
That's correct. That's the whole point. There's
We're
three
moving
people
from
sitting.
allocated member name to unallocated. Still member equity. Doesn't change taxes. Doesn't change the rest.
The unallocated is tax.
Ooh,
The unallocated is tax. Yeah.
So we ran the scenarios and the tax structure we have now doesn't change.
With the DPAD. DPAD's gonna expire in 2 years and they told us that they don't expect it to pass. So I think assuming that it's gonna still be there.
so my dad told me when I was a kid, he said, Dennis, it's okay to talk to yourself. Not that I was doing that, but he said, it's okay to talk to yourself. He said, you got a problem if you start arguing with yourself. And I'm going to show slides where CHS took just the exact opposite position that you're telling us right now. And it's going to be testimony in front of the United States Finance Committee. It's going to be all kinds of slides where just the opposite argument CHS made. So I don't have to say that I'm the one that's saying, I'm just going to use CHS has come at this from both ways. Which is the truth? I don't know. Here we go again. Can I just hit the button here?
Okay, let's say yes.
Okay,
Now it's work, should work again. If that's where you're headed.
thank you. So here's the slide. And I think I heard somebody over here say that they would like to see this. So this is, I didn't walk through all the math on it because it gets to be pretty busy. But here's a slide that says if it's a no vote, in other words, the status quo, you could say on the left side. This is all in millions. It's a 70-30 pat. So if CHS makes $169 million, the members get 106. So it's about 106 million that the members would get. If you go over on the yes side, if this passes, and if it's the max, and to be fair to these guys, they said they're not always going to take the max or whatever, but if it's the max, this is what you get. You get 0, 0 path, 0 total. Excuse me?
What's your definition of member share?
Correct. Correct. This would be allocated equity. And to be clear, when we talk about the difference between allocated and equity, allocated and unallocated, the difference is there's a reasonable, in fact, a high chance that when it's allocated, you're going to get it across your own checking account, right? It's going to hit your checking account. When it's unallocated, you know, we can't really hide behind, oh yeah, you still own it. Well, that's true. That's technically true. But the only way it's going to hit your checking account is in the unlikely event of a liquidation, and the even more unlikely event that there's still something left after the liquidation. So I think it's important to break that down. I mean, can you imagine going into your banker and saying, well, I was just at a meeting in Bismarck the other day. I found out that I got a share of the unallocated reserve of CHS. That's mine. So I want to put that on my balance sheet. I think he or she would push you out the door. And in CHS, for example, they have ownership in other cooperatives. So when they do the 10K, they list it, correct me if I'm wrong, but they list it as whatever the equity balance is on their sheet. They don't put a note in the 10K and say, well, we got a share of the unallocated reserve of Land O'Lakes or whoever that cooperative is. No. So this is allocated equity. So if we look at 500 million pre-tax earnings, the member share is 315, status quo. Look to the right, it's 128. And you can see, everybody can see this already. So if we go to the far right, at 26%, go down to 32%, 35%. I want to be clear. So if we go back to that question of mine, is how much of this should be cash to any business? How much cash should you pull out? I want to be clear that 35, 32, 26, that's cash and equity. That's not just cash. That's both. Is that an appropriate number? And again, to be fair, that's the max, right? So here's the balance sheet of CHS. And I want you to especially focus on the left two columns. So when Tracy, I have deep respect for you, by the way, Tracy, but we're on opposite sides of this issue. When Tracy says that this is unsustainable and that this allocated equity is growing so fast and that makes this whole thing unsustainable, I say, wait a minute. How does that compare to the unallocated equity? Because we've heard how important this unallocated reserve is. So if we look from 1998, and I don't cherry pick numbers, this is year number 1 of CHS to the most recent year, and I'm not accusing you guys of cherry picking because I don't think you did. But this is our history of CHS Incorporated. And if we go from left to right, go in the middle, equity certs, they went up by 6.5 times in 24 years. So the allocated equity went up by a multiple 6.5 times. The unallocated reserve, despite every 90 days getting drained, went up faster, 10.45 times. These are real numbers. The assets, and why are assets important? Because you get a return on your assets, going to give you a profit that's going to redeem this equity, right? Your assets went up 7.62 times. So both the unallocated reserve and the assets both went up faster than the allocated equity did. This is cold hard real math. This is history that you can't dispute. So the allocated as a percentage without the preferred stock, because they don't want to admit that preferred stock is equity, which it is, by the way. But the allocated percentage without the preferred stock went down. We keep hearing it's getting worse, getting worse, getting worse. It went down from 81 to 72%. I'm not sure how that's worse. So the far right column, all I did there was I said, what if on an outcome basis, what if we did that same thing that we've just done for the last 24 years at CHS? What if you could achieve the same outcome? So in other words, take those same assets and we grow them by 7.62 times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, on the bottom right, should be no surprise, this trend goes from 81 to 62. 81 to 72 to 62. So the main takeaway I want you to get from this slide is the trend, if we go back 24 years, isn't a bad trend. It's not, the sky isn't falling. So CHS preferred stock is the elephant in the room. Is it debt? Is it equity? Is it a little of both? And if so, what percentage is debt? What percentage is equity? And is the CHS board and management aligned on this? This is a big deal. This is almost $2.3 billion on the balance sheet of CHS. And as owners, we have a right and an obligation, I would say, to know, is it debt or equity? Or is it a little of this or a little of that? I'm not hearing anything that resembles unity. When I hear the word debt, I'm like, what the heck is that? And then today I heard debt. And when I look at the chart, the one chart you had, you compared CHS with other cooperatives, 36 or whatever. Well, how many of them actually have preferred stock of any significance? Every co-op might have a few dollars of preferred stock laying around, right? When they were first founded, they probably had some shares of preferred stock. But how many have a significant portion of preferred stock that they gotta drain every 90 days out of their unallocated reserve? So that chart you showed when you compared CHS to these other cooperatives, that wasn't fair. Unless they had the same amount of unallocated. You can't take 42-point-some billion dollars every 90 days out of the unallocated reserve of CHS and then have a Christopher Columbus moment where you think you've discovered something you don't have as much unallocated equity as another cooperative that doesn't even have preferred stock. That's not a moment that should come as a surprise. So I guess my question, and Dave, I would like you to weigh in on this, is you did these projections. You said that you had experts and they confirmed as you look forward And you also said today that you think that the CHS preferred stock is debt. So is there alignment then on that? And how did you do it in your projection? So I'm asking a multi-part question, so maybe I'll break it down into two. So the one question is the board and management aligned? You said you think it's debt.
Personally, I do, because I look at it this way, if I borrow money, from him, I don't put it on my. I look at it as, he says I can pay back when I want to. It's debt, you want that money back, right? You're gonna want that money back, trust me. So to me, personally, I look at it as debt, I look at it as an obligation. For us to make sure that dividends are paid. Like, you know, I've already made that. I'm sure that that interest is not principal. The only difference between preferred stock and what I get from the bank is it's not amortized. So that's why it's not called debt. It's debt like. I call it personally debt because I am so committed to making sure that we run this business properly, so those dividends are paid. So there's a variation. But in the CHS, I assure you, it's perceived as debt like. I call it debt personally.
Well, okay, good. The question wasn't how you consider it. The question was, is there alignment between the CHS board and management?
So let's have a question.
Oh, okay.
Into the microphone.
I thought everybody else could hear. I wasn't thinking about. So to answer your question, within the board and the senior staff, we talk about it within capital committee as debt like. Personally, I feel like it's debt. That's my own personal prerogative. I view it as using somebody else's money and we're paying to use it. That's as simple as that.
So when you say that the board and management then thinks of it as debt-like, how would that, so you're telling me that a greater percentage of it would be debt then than equity? Because I would assume that the same analogy could be that it's equity-like too. then.
Sure.
So, okay.
But we treat, from my perspective, and I think the staff and management's treat it as debt-like. But when the financials that are filled out, as was Dan conveyed, it goes under the equity side. So there is an inconsistency there, but we still pay the dividends and it's debt-like. As far as how we manage.
Okay, thank you, David.
I didn't plan to be part of the presentation.
No, but you look good up here.
That's not why. Thank you, but I think there's a little sarcasm there, but I'll go with it.
No. No, well, that was my question for you. So I think it's, I don't know if it's clear enough, but at least.
Dennis, you know the answer to this because you were there. FASB rules are very clear that this is equity. You know that.
So then why don't we go, so then why don't we go to FASB rules? So when you talk to the government under penalty of law, then it's equity. But when you come out to Hicksville, North Dakota, then it's debt-like. I don't think that's fair, guys. Again, we said we want to center on some facts that are true.
Facts are true that the IRS views it and FASB views it as equity. IRS gives us flexibility to make a choice. What you're going to show is our testimony when we want to switch it to the way it is today. Before we had this large amount of equity.
We want to switch what?
The way we handled it, so we had a option in, I think it was 2005, is this on? To elect by the IRS how we have preferred stock in our bachelor's calculations. The IRS gives us flexibility to do it two ways, one to do it, one to not.
And I got that in my slide coming up, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about almost $2.3 billion on our balance sheet. And I don't know how, when you sign your name to a document and you file it with the government, it's equity. But when you come out here, it's debt like, whatever debt like.
Can I respond again? Dennis, you said you bought that land several years ago. I'm sure you got a lot of equity in it. Right? For the price you paid for it, you got a lot of equity. You pay for that equity on a quarterly basis? No. It's yours, it's equity. So to me, true equity, you're not paying for it on a quarterly basis. That's why in this situation with preferred stock, from my perspective, it's a debt.
So why does one of your experts, PwC, they're one of the big three, I think you consider them an expert. Why then do they mandate to you? Anybody can Google is preferred stock, debt or equity, PwC. And there will be a chart. There's a lot of heavy reading before you get to the chart, but you get to this chart. And the chart clearly indicates that the preferred stock, if the board and only the board of directors of whatever company we're talking about has the exclusive ability as to whether or not it ever gets paid out or not. That makes it equity. CHS has 3 buckets of equity. They got allocated equity, they got unallocated equity, and they got preferred stock, and they're all equity. And I didn't mean to get into a debate. Sorry about that. We'll continue with the presentation, but obviously we disagree on that. But again, I'm looking to your expert that said under penalties of law that it's equity. And why don't you put the word debt like into the 10K then?
Asking.
Yeah.
So what you're describing is how we view equity. What we're talking to you about is how we use the dividend. And whether we can do that.
It's not a dividend if it's debt, it's interest. You can go to wallstreetmojo.com and they will tell you that there's about 9 things that's the difference between interest and dividend. Completely different. Totally different. Guess what? You cannot, with these dividends that you're paying, that you're trying to say now are interest like, you cannot legally pay more than 8% on it. If it was interest, you could pay 12% on it, 15%.
So Dennis, we're not asking for a change in the way we put it on the balance sheet. We're asking for change in the way we handle the dividends and our package calculation, which is at the discretion, you know the bylaws, it's at the discretion of the board. Correct? Board has
It's a whole different topic. The topic is it debt or equity? Thank you. I'll continue with my presentation. So this wasn't about getting into a debate about it. But the only way this works, people, is if you think about the CHS preferred stock. And this was so this happened, I don't know, 1999 or 2000, whatever year when CHS first came out with their preferred stock. It was clearly understood that the preferred stock and the unallocated were going to work hand in hand to be permanent capital of CHS Incorporated. And that's the only way that any of this makes any sense is if you think through it that way, because as you're draining the unallocated reserve every 90 days, it's the preferred stock is why you're draining it. You're paying these dividends. And now, if you want to change your mindset and you want to say, well, now we think of it as debt like or debt or whatever, well, then the whole thing doesn't work. Of course it doesn't work then. That's my point. So the board is in total control. The CHS preferred stock is considered permanent equity. I don't know, when I go to a bank, if I'm going to borrow money, at some point I got to pay the principal back. This principal never has to be paid back. Never, ever, ever does this have to be paid back. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. Well, one more point on that. Some people have said, well, this, I think that, CHS would be willing to call back this preferred stock, and these guys can't go down this road. So we don't want to get them in legal trouble. But if CHS for some reason would want to call back that preferred stock, maybe it'd be a good idea to vote for this bylaw proposal. Well, I want you to think about that a little bit. If this passes, does the CHS preferred stock become more attractive or less attractive? I think it clearly becomes more attractive then, wouldn't it? So when you got something that's more attractive, you get rid of it? Or you get more of it? What happens if you get more of it? Now, instead of talking about 169 million, how much money are we talking about? And who makes the decision as to whether more preferred stock gets issued? Not the people sitting in here today, is it? Now, I'm not saying that that's what they would do, but it's a possibility. Sure, of course.
The way it is right now, we're asking for the bylaw change to allow for us to deduct the dividends or interest-like expense each year in the calculation of patronage. In the meantime, we're paying the rate that you commented on, plus we are paying the patronage out too, which makes it far more expensive than just the simple dividend.
That's correct.
Very much so. Okay, this is the way you're looking at it. To answer your question, given the interest rates in the market we're in today, interest rates are rising. If we had the ability to deduct the dividends, like we're asking for, given the rising interest rates, hanging on to this preferred stock may not be a bad idea indefinitely. If interest rates go up to 10%, this is going to look like a sweet deal for not doing the calculation of patronage. Right? So when you're I'm answering your questions, Dennis. Do you get more? What do you do? Do we hold it? Do we never call it? That all enters in. That's a conversation that we're going to be having going forward, given the markets we're in. So I'm just responding to the question you asked.
That's fair. But if you think interest rates are going to 10 or 12, then you probably hurry up and issue some more of it, right? But it's a little more complicated than that because we don't have time for that discussion. But anyway. So here's a look at the balance sheet of CHS. Now, in my previous chart, I showed that we took the preferred stock out of the calculation. So we obviously disagree on whether or not that's equity. But if we look at it as being equity, then if we go from 2022 to 2021, we actually drop. Yeah, but 2021 is on the far right. So we actually drop from 58 to 57% in terms of the amount of allocated equity as to the total equity. And if I didn't have the preferred stock on there, if we did the math on the rest of it, it would actually be a bigger percent drop. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's pretty simple. It's not getting worse, people. It's getting better. So I don't know. I don't know how. I mean, we're looking at the same numbers. How can somebody look at this and say it's getting worse and it's unsustainable? We went from 58 to 57.
Is that number in this? I'm not following.
So this is total equity. 9.461266 total equity. And what is the percentage of the total equity that's got somebody's name on it? It went from 58% last year to 57% this year. So how are we getting worse? Plus, we got a strong balance sheet. This is to illustrate that under penalty of law, they sign their names that it's equity. So I think my underlying part here got a little bit out of whack, but again, it talks about patrons' equity, including the preferred stock. It's equity. Dividends may not exceed 8%. This talks about the ability to put a lien. If you fall behind on the CHS, they can put a lien on the equity that you have and your allocated equity. But it also says that they could put a lien on your preferred stock. It's pretty hard to put a lien on debt. I think most people would say, if you want my debt, go ahead and take it. Here it says that the payments of the dividends are not guaranteed. Our board of directors can elect from any time to time for any infinite indefinite duration, not pay the dividends for all kinds of different reasons. There's a certain amount of flexibility right here. This talks about, this is another reason why it's not interest. So any portion, the second sentence, any portion of the distribution in excess of our current accumulated earnings and profits is treated first as a non-taxable return of capital. What that means is if they don't, if there was no unallocated reserve and there was no earnings there, that unlike interest, you would have to actually write down, if you bought the stock at $25, you'd actually have to take, say you got a 50-cent patronage, you'd have to write down your stock, your basis to $24.50 if you bought it at 25. But here's the thing I want you to think about. Again, think back to the three players. You got three players sitting at this table. So if we look here, income derived by us from non-patronage sources is not entitled to the single tax benefit of subchapter T and is taxed to us at corporate income rates. So when CHS takes this money and they divert it from going into the allocated and they put it into the unallocated, they lose this ability of single taxation. They just put it into a double taxation. So again, those three players, guess what? Uncle Sam's going to get more. If Uncle Sam gets more, how about the member in the co-op? Well, if the co-op wants more and Uncle Sam gets more, what does that leave for you? Here, and this is all out of 10Ks and CHS, like CHS preferred stock prospectus. So this is again back to what my dad said. All right to talk to yourself, but don't argue with yourself. So here, if any changes are made to the income tax, or if in the future we're not eligible to be taxed as a cooperative, our tax liability would significantly increase, which means our net income would significantly decrease. Well, just because the government didn't make you put it into the unallocated, the same tax would apply. So this is testimony from, or this was written out, Todd Eskelson. This was in 2007. So this request that CHS is making of you, the member, there was a time that the government, I think Dan referred to it, there was a time the government mandated that it be this other way. And CHS moved heaven and earth to say, we don't want it that way. And we got to get this changed. But now they're coming back and saying, well, and the law did change. They were effective in getting the law changed. Steve, you and I, and Bruce Anderson, I think we were out there lobbying, and it was called the nickname the triple tax law. We don't want to get triple taxed, so we got to change this law so we can change it over. Well, now that we got it changed over, I guess we want to be triple taxed. So the net result of the DAR was to make dividends tax inefficient for cooperatives. And at the bottom, thus the funds distributed as dividends by cooperatives were subject to double and arguably triple taxation, first at the cooperative level and then at the member level. How does this work? By reducing the patronage dividend deduction, an additional tax is generated on the cooperative's patronage earnings. This is in essence a third tax on cooperatives. Now I'm going to be blunt. I don't think I agreed back then that was a third tax, a triple tax. And I'm not saying I do today, I think, but it's a double tax, right? Here's my last chart. I'm a blunt person. I'm sure I ruffled some feathers today. I apologize for that, but I don't ever want anybody to ever accuse me of double speak. So I hope we can disagree on a lot of things, but I really think it's important I hope you believe me that everything I've said to you to the best of my knowledge is true, and with that, I guess I'll open it up to some questions. And I'm not accusing anybody here of double speaking either. We need to come together on these issues. We need to have this type of discussion. So the question is there a time where CHS could not be able to redeem their equity in a timely fashion? Would that encapsulate it? Yeah. Well, again, none of us have a crystal ball, right? You can, it's in a perfect world. In a perfect world, and you think about equity and patronage programs, it would be a nice stair-step increase of everything. Your assets, your income, your allocated, your unallocated would be a nice stair-step. We don't live in a perfect world. We live in a commodity-based business that we're dealing with. And you get this. So when you looked at that one chart, you know, ideally it would kind of go up like this, but what happened was there were the years when you didn't do very well. So it depends on what your belief system is. A pessimist will say, when you're not earning much, they're going to say, oh my gosh, look at this amount of equity that's coming in front of us, and we're only making this much and we can't redeem it. And that same pessimist will say, when the earnings are through the roof, oh yeah, we can easily redeem what's back here, but look at all the equity we're putting on the books. And an optimist will say, well, don't worry, it's going to balance out. We've done this for 95 years. It's worked for 95 years. And yeah, our members, they're willing to work with us. They're willing to understand we're going through some tough times. And yeah, your equity redemption period is going to get longer. But again, when it gets longer, the burden to the cooperative gets less. And that's why it's worked for 95 years. Because the burden gets less. And then all of a sudden you get a year like this past year, and you go back and you can clean up a lot of it. What part of that? I don't understand why that's complicated. I think the question should be to the three gentlemen that came so far away, and I think we should give them respect for coming into the lion's den, and this is not easy. And I think we owe them a lot of respect, a lot of gratitude. But if you got any questions for me, you can always talk to me. But I think I'll turn it back over. Questions for those that are on the board.
All right, if has any other questions come in online? No, so everybody answered everything. One question.
Well, I just, listen, I want to reciprocate. I know you guys been providing concern, hope I'm expressed. You guys individually, that we're not taking away the whole picture for CHS. We just want you understand. Please take that. I want to add parts on my that is he had the third most prestigious discussion we have ever had was whether we would retain 10% earnings to try and move from being paid that's what we're trying to do. That we're just talking about 10%. So when you guys come up with 45%, there's miles of difference here. And I just want you guys to know that there is a function.
Any other questions for the board or Dennis or anybody else in the room? All right, seeing none, everybody have safe travels home. And again, thanks to the guys for traveling up here, and wish you a speedy and safe return home for those guys as well as everybody in the room. So, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming out.
Absolutely, thank you.
Other questions?
Good to see you, sir. Oh, yeah, you gotta get to here. Have a safe trip.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. That's all we're gonna do. So.